안녕하십니까. 중앙대학교 총장 박상규입니다. 우리 대학의 교육학과 BK21 4팀에서 주최하는 2023년 글로벌 휴먼 인게이지먼트 컨퍼런스에 참석하신 여러분들을 중앙대학교의 가족 모두와 함께 진심으로 환영합니다. 1916년에 설립된 중앙대학교는 이제 대한민국 최고의 글로벌 연구 중심 대학으로 도약하는 중입니다. 우리는 대학을 국제적으로 인정받는 세계적 수준의 연구대학으로 변모시키는 것을 목표로 국제적 학술 교류와 협력을 더욱 적극적으로 추진하고 있습니다. 이번 국제학술대회의 의제는 Engagement for Future, Learning and People Analytics입니다. 21세기에 들어서 세계는 경험해보지 못한 길을 가고 있습니다. 코로나19 팬데믹으로 인해 기후변화 대응과 디지털 전환의 중요성이 더욱 부각되었고 글로벌 패권 경쟁의 심화로 세계 경제의 불확실성은 더욱 커지고 있습니다. 특히 지난 몇 년은 코로나19 팬데믹으로 인해 교육의 역사 속 가장 격변하는 시간이었습니다. 교육 현장 전반에 테크놀로지 기반 학습이 보편화되고 학교 교육과 성인 교육 모두에서 온라인 수업이 확산되고 있습니다. 한편 오랜 시간 문제시되어 왔던 부유한 학생과 빈곤한 학생, 농촌과 도시, 인종과 민족 간의 학업 성취도 간극이 전 세계적으로 심화되고 있습니다. 학습자들은 단지 학업적인 것뿐만 아니라 그들의 웰빙과 정신 건강에도 타격을 받게 되었습니다. 하지만 이러한 위기 상황은 더 나은 미래를 창조하는 원동력이 될 수 있습니다. 교육의 비전인 목표부터 시스템까지 새로운 교육의 모습을 설계하는 논의가 이어지고 있습니다. 우리는 그 해답을 몰입과 디지털 테크놀로지의 연계에서 찾고자 합니다. 오늘 국제학술대회는 인공지능 및 몰입 주제와 관련된 쟁점들을 중심으로 세계적 석학 및 글로벌 리더들과 함께 몰입 촉진을 위한 디지털 테크놀로지의 교육적 가능성에 대해 숙고해 볼 수 있는 장으로 마련되었습니다. 인공지능 시대 교육계와 산업계가 나아갈 방향에 대해 발표자와 참석자 여러분의 소중한 지혜를 모아주시기를 바랍니다. 다시 한번 여러분들을 진심으로 환영하며 성공적이고 유익한 학술대회가 되기를 기원합니다. 감사합니다.
Hi, all. I'm Professor George Siemens. It's a real privilege to be able to spend a little bit of time speaking with your conference and with your event. I have never had the opportunity to date to visit South Korea, so it's a delight to be able to actually present and deliver a few reflections and remarks to you from a distance. What I want to talk about today is questions that we're all aware of now and which is prominent in most of our conversation, which is what and how should we teach when we're starting to see artificial intelligence on the horizon that learns as fast or in some cases even faster than what human beings do. None of you who've been tracking any of the news and the trends in the education space will be surprised to hear that artificial intelligence is currently the hottest buzzword in the education space. For example, the late last year release of ChatGPT, which is a sort of fine-tuned version of GPT-3 from OpenAI, has presented individuals with enormous creative capacity for creating content, writing code, doing everything from synthesizing data and giving really a glimpse into what the future might look like when we're talking about artificial intelligence. Well, let's start by saying, what is AI? Well, there's a number of definitions of AI, but basically a more convoluted one is that we're dealing with science and computational technologies that in some ways mimic the human nervous system, its ability to sense, learn, and take action in some kind of a meaningful way. And that came out of a Stanford 100 Years of AI study. In a more formal way, there's three clusters that we're looking at, and they're sometimes intermixed as one, and I'm not even going to talk about the robot side of things, which is sort of the embodiment of AI, but just generally. There's the broad structure, which is artificial intelligence. This came out of the Dartmouth event in the 1950s, and McCarthy then defined artificial intelligence as basically the science and engineering of making intelligent machines. More recently, and this is what many of us experience in some of these areas, is around the domain of machine learning. And that is just the ability to learn without being explicitly programmed. So, for example, at a very rudimentary level, the way that your email spam is processed can be a function of a machine learning algorithm. And you don't have to necessarily teach it exactly what's spam, but it'll be able to detect patterns from other resources that it has access to. And then finally, neural networks and deep learning, which is what is really underpinning the move behind these large language models, or LLMs, such as the GPT-3 model and a couple of the tool sets that Google and other big tech companies have been working on really for the last decade more aggressively. Now, it's not just in that space, though, as a tool. Generally, there's been a long period where we've heard that AI would make a difference, and all of a sudden we're seeing it's happening, and it's happening rapidly. So, for example, by towards the second half of last year, almost 6% of all peer-reviewed articles that were being published worldwide were somehow related to artificial intelligence. And a recent report coming out of Australia suggested that in science, we're going to have an enormous impact of AI. On the one hand, it could be enablement, making existing practices a little bit easier. But on the other hand, it could be a full transformation where AI completely changes how research is done. And some of the protein folding research, for example, that has come out of DeepMind would suggest that at least in some areas, it will be a transformational process. So my framework, or my model for this, if you will, is really quite basic. And this is how we got to where we are. So if something is digital, it produces data. And this is really from probably the 70s, but more accelerating the 80s and certainly hitting its stride in the 90s. It produces some kind of data that's captured. So the digital technologies that now form our daily lives produce data that we then use for analytics. And now that we've been in the analytics space for a large period of time, we're starting to see artificial intelligence. That's the next level or the next stage. I was involved early on with the development of learning analytics as a field, and certainly seeing even in that area, we have our next conference being held in about 2 months' time in Arlington, Texas, where we'll be unpacking the state of learning analytics. And increasingly, that conversation is going to involve AI and AI technologies. And the data that we're capturing just in our schools, keep in mind, this is the basics of future AI models, but the data we're capturing in our schools or in our universities are fairly significant now. Basic things such as the use of their technology, learning management systems. It could be assessment, it could be ebooks, websites, it could be wearable technologies, multimodal data. We're starting to use more work with integrated sensors and sensor technology in classrooms as well. And then, of course, national and state level repositories that gain insight into how students are learning and what they're doing in learning processes. So basically, anything that's digital has the capacity to generate data, and that in turn forms the basis of AI. Because AI, once we have a large enough data set, can provide an augmentation of human capacity. We just held our third annual conference on empowering learners for the age of AI. And we had a speaker, Chris Deedy from Harvard, who talked about AI as an augmenting technology, something that makes people more capable of partnering with this technology to be more intelligent. So not replacing, but augmenting. And so from our end, when we think of it in learning processes, and I'll get to this toward the end of the talk, that starts to become a significant challenge, is the way that you manage the integration of AI into human cognitive systems and into human knowledge practices. So there's this an activity that I think we all sort of need to confront, and that is around the idea of, what is it that we should be teaching? And for that matter, how should we be teaching when machines learn exponentially faster, than what a human being can do? So in this case, here's a few illustrations of technologies that have mastered and outperformed human performance. So in this case, the red line is the human performance line, just in terms of errors. And at this place, AI, in this case, image recognition, outperformed humans and continues to outperform humans. And again, we see the same effect with image recognition. Sometime in 2015 to 2016, it starts to outperform people, and it just keeps outperforming them. The same holds true in areas like chess, where at a certain point, once it crosses the threshold, again, this is the red dotted line on your screen, that's when you have an indication that it is outperforming and doing better than a human being would in that kind of a cognitive task. There's different activities such as language comprehension. That's a little bit more challenging in some cases, but by the same account, there is a stage at which these technologies hit and then exceed human capacity. Some basic tools like Atari, for example, has a much lower threshold, where in 2013, an automated system could outperform humans, and since then it just hasn't looked back. So some interesting lessons here, and this is based on the EFF's AI progress measure, which just gives us an insight into the areas and the spaces where AI is now more effective and is now better than we are as human beings. And that causes us, I think, a need to pause and at least ask ourselves the question that I initiated, which is, what should we be teaching when AI is faster at everything than we are? And for that matter, how should we be starting to teach some of those things? When we talk about knowledge work, it's not simply an example of a complex technology that has made progress in one space. So let me give you an example of what I mean. The technologies that I shared are typically complex algorithms from the AI Progress Index. These are technologies that have been extensively researched. Primarily, researchers have access to them. Most of us won't directly play with, say, AlphaGo Zero or any of the complex algorithms that can defeat humans in various online strategy games. But what we do have instead, and this is the current suite of AI technologies, and this happened late last year, was all of a sudden the tools that used to be in labs or that we would read about in online sites or on newspapers or see programs on TV, these technologies suddenly jumped out of labs, in this case ChatGPT being the most prominent, and suddenly it was a tool we could play with. Anyone could go and play with this technology. And we started to realize, whoa, this is something that's really unique and has some potentially dramatic implications for how we structure our schools. And here's just a few examples of different tool sets. I won't go through all of them in details, but I'll have shared the slides with conference organizers and they can share it with attendees. But here's a few things that we can see AI doing already. So on the one hand, if you want a literature review done, a tool set like Iris AI can accelerate and make a literature review more impactful. Strategy games such as Cicero, Meta's platform, is able to go out and perform at a human strategy level. Writing code through GitHub Copilot, again, greatly improves the quality and the output of code that people create. And the list goes on from a range of tools for writing, conversing, Google's Lambda, which I misspelled there, ChatGPT, DALL-E 2 for creating images and art. And these are tools that have won art competitions, and the list goes on. So what we have now, and probably most effectively 2022, could be described as the year of generative AI. And generative AI is essentially technologies that can create the way that we perhaps once thought only human beings can create. So for educators, that gives us, both at the K-12 and university level, and actually even in the corporate sector, it gives us an opportunity to look at what do we have available to us and what are ways that we might want to start doing things differently in order to broaden our impact. So here's my logic that I'll unpack in about 8 points on what I think this means to the system and why I believe that the challenges that we're confronting now are ones that we need to take seriously as government officials, as members of society, as teachers, as students. So first, let's take a little bit of a historical look. We have generally created institutions to work with information. And this goes back, at least in the Western tradition, to the earliest scrolls, to the Library of Alexandria, to the development of the printing press, and so on. And these institutions are essentially ways to work with information. When information became too significant, there was too much of it, we started to create classification systems, such as, or taxonomy, such as the Linnaean taxonomy. We created encyclopedias, and we generated institutions, universities, libraries, and so on. So the challenge then is, we have a lot of information. We get so much information that we then need to find new ways of managing it. Up until about 20 years ago, all of a sudden we started getting the ability for anyone to generate information. At this point, we called it Web 2.0, but it was a set of tools that enabled people to create anything, and we were connected globally and we shared globally. As we had this enormous amount of data rise up, then we had big tech companies, in this case it was actually Yahoo and others, that developed databases or file systems that allowed us to work with huge quantities of data that wouldn't work with the existing classification systems anymore. So that presented then with our 4 key points. We create institutions to work with information. As we get more information, we create new systems. These systems work fine until we find new ways to create more information, such as Web 2.0. And then we need to create new mechanisms to manage that information. And that's where data science and analytics came in. As we had large enough data sets and computational capacity of these technologies increased, the algorithms themselves became more sophisticated, then we entered into a new stage where AI starts to become a significant challenge. When that AI, as is listed here in point 6 and 7, starts to perform cognitively at a human level, and keep in mind from some of those images I had, once it breaks the barrier of human performance, these humans don't suddenly get twice as smart, but an AI does. So once it breaks that human performance barrier, we never reclaim that space again, meaning it is now the domain of AI. And these machines then, as they outlearn and perform faster than we do, we need to start thinking differently about how to structure our education systems and what to do in those settings, because it makes no sense for us to teach and have students learn things that AI can do at a much more rapid rate. And so we're again confronting, we're always, as we get deeper into these conversations, we're always confronting this challenge of what does this mean for education at a K-12 level, at a university level, and even at a corporate learning or a lifelong level. Well, the particular challenge that we face is especially around creativity, because for a long time we didn't feel that AI could create in the way that humans can. But that's changing. Now with generative AI, we're starting to realize it can create podcasts, it can create movies, images, text, video clips. There's a lot that it can do. And there's interesting statements always stuck with me that Steve Jobs had, because we're crossing this threshold with the computers that and the computational capacity that we have now. But Jobs has a statement where he says, here's a simple thing. If you get a computer to do something, and if it does a thing at a certain rate, that's fine. But when it does it at a much more accelerated rate, and let's say it's doing something at 1,000,000 times per second, the results start to become magic, or to look like magic. And I think that's what we're connecting here in this regard, is we're starting to see that the computational capacity is now so great, the data set is so large, that we're starting to see what Jobs would call magic emerge in things like writing, language, code writing, creating images, creating podcasts, and so on. Now, what's important here is that there is, for the education systems globally, there is an emerging landscape where we need to become more active in being part of this system, working with big tech to create algorithms and large data models or foundation models, because what matters isn't what's actually important or what has an impact. What matters are the things that get connected. And many schools and universities are sitting on the outside watching these big tech companies go through this process of creating infrastructures that we're going to have to react to, not ones that we're dynamically involved in. So we have to particularly pay attention to systems and system science. So from a complexity lens, how these things all work together and how they fit together, because we have seen a lot of unbundling of the traditional classroom. This has happened due to new tools, new technologies come in. We now have students who can learn online, they can learn through video, they can learn through open online courses. And now we're starting to see this system of education start to rebundle. It was unbundled over many years, over 2 decades, and now it's being put back together again. And it's being put together with some tech companies at the center or some startups at the center, and it raises important questions for public institutions. As Freire noted, that knowledge comes through invention, and this idea of reinvention, where we're constantly engaging with one another, learning and creating new things. But this is now an AI agent. And the question for us becomes, you have human cognition, which is obviously what we do in our school systems and we do in our lives. Then we have artificial cognition, but this is increasingly owned by big tech or by large organizations, and that raises important implications for the long-term future of human cognitive capabilities. So with that as sort of the broad overview of the landscape, I just want to put a few quick slides in on what I think should be taught and then how we should be teaching things. Because again, part of my argument is that big technology firms own more of our future than we're aware of or paying attention to, partly because schools and governments and universities have been late paying attention to how this huge data amounts globally are being aggregated by a few small companies and the implications that has. So I think we should be teaching and focusing our school system at least 7 things, and I'll unpack one of them in a bit. But AI and data literacy. We should be teaching interconnectedness of everything. We should be teaching students how to think about and envision new futures. How systems change. How does one result here produce a different result in another part of the system? We should teach the people states of being. Who we are as people increasingly matters more than what we know. The idea of working and navigating complexity. If anything, the last few years of public health crisis has taught us that we need to learn to be flexible and navigate complex spaces. And then, of course, how we collaborate with non-human intelligence. I did an article a number of years ago on connectivism, the idea that we're functionally networked in our learning. And I think the question arises, what does connectivism look like, network learning look like when AI is a fundamental agent? And so I think a big part of what we want our students to be able to do is to be systems makers, realizing that the systems and the structures that have served modern society well are somewhat being pulled apart, and there's new systems emerging. And so it's a power question. The idea of creating, and I'll move to the bottom point here, networking power. It's the idea that individuals and today's youth, and you see this often with social media activism and political activity, that youth need to realize and be nurtured into network making power, namely that they're actively engaged in creating, producing, and generating networks. And this is critical because one of the reasons we sort of have this challenge that we're facing is that we have people who are great at education policy. They don't understand technology or AI. And we have people who are great on the technology side that aren't really that aware of the policy side of it. And that's why we have this disconnect where we're sort of giving away large parts of our future because we haven't been paying attention to AI. And the point that I'd emphasize again is it's a question of beingness. It's this idea that our education system should focus on things that can't be duplicated by technology or mastered by AI, because that's really the final domain of human cognitive capabilities. And the question then is, how should we be teaching? I'm very biased to teaching in networks and network systems. I think an individual classroom doesn't make sense anymore, and a sole expert doesn't make sense. If you agree with the assertion that knowledge is networked and that learning is the process of forming networks, then we need a diversity of opinions, perspectives, broad scale socialization, often internationally, active negotiation as part of the learning process. And we should be able to create artifacts and generate outputs that can then be used in meaningful ways in various settings. So, and then ultimately, the teaching and learning process should mirror digital networks. So I think my core hypothesis over the last several decades has been that the future of society's knowledge institutions will match what we can do with information. And we need to build in more active participatory pedagogical approaches where individuals are creating digital artifacts and resources which then serve as a node for someone else's understanding in some other setting or some other capacity. I'll just leave you with a couple of quick slides or links on the screen. One is the Global Research Alliance for AI in Learning and Education. We have a number of webinars coming up, particularly around ChatGPT and the impact that'll have on the future of education. We have in the lift.c3l.ai link, we will be launching early next week a course on artificial intelligence literacies for the school sector. And for those of you that are interested in AI and learning, the final link is a weekly email on AI technologies and the way that those are impacting the education landscape.
Hello, my name is Bart Rienties. I'm a professor of learning analytics at the Institute of Educational Technology at the Open University UK, and it's a great pleasure to be here, at least online, at the Global Human Engagement Conference at Chung-Ang University. If after the talk you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me via Twitter or via email. And all the papers that I discuss in this brief talk are all available at the link below. And what I hope to talk to you today about is the lessons we have learned from implementing learning analytics and learning design at scale. The Open University, the organization that I work for, has over 200,000 students and more than 7,000 members of staff. And we provide real-time learning analytics to our staff and increasingly also to some of our students. So my aim with you today is to start to think about where to start with learning analytics and learning design in your own organization. Secondly, hopefully my talk will help you to think about how to effectively support your own staff to use data. And thirdly, and perhaps most crucially, critically review whether or not learning analytics or learning design is something for your organization or not. I personally always really like models, and one of the models I really like about learning analytics is the one that you can find below, which is developed by a group of German researchers nearly 10 years ago. And what this figure very nicely illustrates is we all have our students on their phone, on their tablets, whatever digital device they have, and they continuously are using those devices and interacting with other students. And while they're interacting with other students, they, of course, leave traces, and those traces could be potentially really interesting to see whether they're engaging with materials or with activities or with each other, how they're participating, writing, making sense of the world. And some of these data will be captured in a learning management system like Moodle or Blackboard or Canvas. And of course, there are issues about data privacy, which I will touch upon a little bit later. But then much smarter people than me basically are able to transform these data into really interesting analytics data mining warehouses, where this analytics warehouses allows us to present these learning analytics data into hopefully meaningful dashboards. And these dashboards are typically given to teachers, and the teacher may then reflect upon what is going well in the course, what is perhaps not going so well, and perhaps consider to make interventions either directly in the course based on the engagement patterns, or perhaps consider to inform a student, hey, you're doing really well, or perhaps another student, hey, you might need to pick up on this activity because I can see that you're perhaps not as engaged as all the other students. I've visited many organizations across the globe, and most universities, including my own university, basically use this kind of learning analytics model. And obviously a missing link in this narrative is how to then involve students. And oftentimes what you see is that learning analytics is mostly used to empower teachers. But of course, we have to critically review and reflect upon whether or not it would also make sense to provide this data to students. And over the years, there have been fantastic amounts of research highlighting basically the relevance and importance of learning analytics. So this is just a screenshot of the Web of Science, and there are over 4,500 papers now written on learning analytics, and many of those papers have primarily also focused on how to support teachers and students to make effective use of learning analytics. And in particular, a recent meta-study by Hernandez and Menendez has provided a fantastic kind of meta review of how 17 organizations across the globe, including the Open University, have implemented learning analytics at scale. And I would highly recommend you to have a look at these at this meta review. And what they basically have identified are three kind of stakeholders that could benefit from learning analytics. On the one hand, of course, are learners, and they might improve their engagement because of the learning analytics dashboards that they get. They are able to get personalized feedback and all kinds of other opportunities for students, like improving their learning outcomes. At the same time, for faculty, it's a great opportunity to get real-time feedback of how well our students are doing, allows our staff to provide warning signals if needed, but most importantly, perhaps also to make pedagogically informed decisions of what is working well and what is working perhaps not so well. And on an institutional level, it allows institutions like the Open University to identify which courses are doing really well, which courses are providing a really good starting point for the next course, and which courses might need a little bit more attention. And what I will do is compare and contrast this a little bit with the lived experiences at the Open University. So as you can see in the bottom, we've published over 300 papers on learning analytics. And what we've learned over the years is that in particular, in terms of learning analytics for students, it is also a great way to help to support access and inclusion of students that are perhaps from a non-traditional background. And furthermore, what we call in the UK EDI, which is equality, diversity and inclusion, it provides us with lots of mechanisms to identify students who are perhaps not so traditional students and help them to provide personalized feedback. The biggest advantage I've noticed of working with learning analytics at the Open University and talking to lots and lots of staff is learning analytics provides an improved pedagogical awareness of teachers, because they can directly see when they're changing a particular element in the course. They can then see how students are reacting to this. The second main effect that we found was that by using learning analytics at scale with our staff, this has substantially improved data literacy and confidence of using data by staff. And it has perhaps surprisingly also been a driver for change, because lots of teachers are using learning analytics to say, hey, I've made this change and see how this has impacted my students in terms of satisfaction or retention. And on an institutional level, what we have found is that it allows institutions to identify good practice of teachers, modules or qualifications that do really well. And it also allows institutions to see where there's potential alignment or misalignment. And lastly, but not leastly, it also allows us to compare us with other institutions if we would want to. While this all looks very promising, of course, there are also some challenges that are present in learning analytics. And the ethics and privacy is one of them, as identified by Hernandez de Mendes, but we have already installed an ethics policy since 2014, which is publicly available. If you just Google Open University Ethics Learning Analytics Policy, you will find that. Second concern, of course, is the scope and the quality of data, and that's how we have a data governance team. A fourth challenge is the insufficient research is done in learning analytics, and we would argue that the OU is definitely one of the bigger players in the world on this, and whether or not the institution has really embedded learning analytics. And I think we've made some really good progress on this. Where we haven't made as much progress as we would have wanted is trying to understand how the decisions people make in modules influences the progression of students over their journey of studying through a qualification where more work is needed. And also in terms of the theoretical and educational foundations and practice, there's still a lot of scope for actual adoption and sense making. That's what I will talk about in the next 11 or so minutes. So what you see here is the flagship learning analytics tool OU Analyze, and what we've been doing since 2014 is to basically predict, is a student going to still be here to submit their next assignment? And what we do is we basically provide teachers with personalized dashboards in terms of which of their students are progressing well and are likely to submit their next assignment, and which students are not so likely to submit their next assignment, or what the teacher could do to do this. And I'm not gonna focus a lot on this. You can just find it by just Googling OU Analyze. But we've been tracking and tracing not only teachers, but also not only students, but also teachers. And when we started in 2013-14, we had 2 teachers. In 2015, we had 58 teachers, and of which 89% of the teachers used it actively. Then we had 700 teachers, etc., etc. And in 2018-19, we had 3,400 teachers. And lastly, currently in the current state, basically all our associate lecturers, and this is how we call them, have access to our learning analytics dashboard. So on the one hand, we've had a tremendous growth and continuous refinement of these dashboards based on the fantastic feedback from our associate lecturers. At the same time, if you look at a slightly different way to the data, what we've seen is that the actual engagement of teachers seems to have dropped substantially. So while in the early stages, a vast majority of teachers were using it, later on we found that only around a third of these teachers actively used these weekly predictions. And we've done a lot of qualitative analysis to try to understand why this is the case. And we identified a range of factors that were critical in whether or not teachers were adopting learning analytics. So one was the faculty's engagement of OU Analyze. In certain faculties, the deans and executive deans, the associate deans of learning and teaching really encouraged teachers to use it and continuously supported teachers to help to use learning analytics. Another thing that helped really well in certain faculties was that some teachers were appointed as champions that basically helped other teachers to get familiar with the system and to make use of the system. The third factor, what we found seemed to be very important, is certain faculties or units really encourage active evidence generation and dissemination of what worked and what doesn't work. A fourth factor, which of course is difficult in the short run to change, is the digital literacy of teachers. Some teachers feel really comfortable with data, while other teachers are perhaps slightly more skeptical, and this seemed to have an influence on whether or not teachers were actively using OU Analyze or not. And then last but not least, some teachers felt very comfortable using OU Analyze because it fitted with their pedagogy, but others felt that this was not part of their identity. And this, of course, has well, because we can't make it mandatory at this point in time. It's a decision that you can rightfully understand from a teacher. So recently, our Vice Chancellor, Professor Tim Blackman, has made an appeal to all 6,000 plus associate lecturers to actually start to make use of this learning analytics, because we know from our research that those teachers who actively use learning analytics actually provide a much better service to our students and have better retention rates. So hopefully the final push by our Vice Chancellor will convince the remaining 2/3 of teachers to make use of learning analytics. And the reason why this is important is that other research has shown that the way that experienced teachers are using OU Analyze is, at best, perhaps patchy. What you see here is a eye tracking study that was done by Anna Gillespie. And in this study, she put a very experienced associate lecturers who've worked at least for a year with OU Analyze, and she gave them a task to work through a course and to try to identify whether or not whether a student needed some support or not. And what she found by using these eye tracking data and qualitative follow-ups was that some teachers made some really erroneous interpretations of the actual data. And this makes a lot of sense because we know ourselves when we're trying to make sense of the world. You know, each of us develops stories in their minds of how a system might work. But if we don't really understand how teachers are making sense of this, we might think that providing dashboards is a good idea. But if they make perhaps difficulties, if they misunderstand the data, then of course it can lead to grave consequences. In particular, as a range of studies have shown, and I'm just showing you one of them, that even a very small intervention, which we did in this particular study of a particular group at risk, can have a very long-term impact over months and months of study. We really believe that teachers are really essential in providing appropriate support. So it's really important that we A, get the data correct, and B, that we provide teachers with appropriate tools to help to support our students. And one way to do this is the magic of learning design. And in a range of studies at the open universities, we have basically shown, probably one of the few universities in the world, where we have continuously linked how teachers are designing courses substantially and significantly influences how our students are studying. So, for example, in a study presented here, we've analyzed on a week-by-week basis how 40 courses followed by 19,000 students were followed by students, and we could basically identify 4 types of typical designs, ranging from more individualistic constructivist learning designs towards more active social constructivist learning designs. And what we found, that the way how teachers design activities significantly predicts how students are then engaging on the respective tasks. And what we furthermore found was a kind of dichotomy between student satisfaction and student retention. Those students who successfully completed courses and were able to complete the student satisfaction survey seemed to indicate that they really liked those more individualistic constructivist learning designs, while in particular they didn't like to work with others in a course, and they didn't like if there were lots of assessments in the course. While in terms of student retention, we found exactly the opposite effect, where the best predictor of whether or not students passed courses was when teachers included communication activities like student to student, teacher to student, student to teacher activities, as well as assessment. And what we have found over a range of studies, and this is a really shocking figure in a way, if you like, is that 69% of what our students are doing at the Open University in a week-by-week basis is determined by us teachers. And the reason that I put this in bold is that it deeply reflects on our importance as teachers, because how we as teachers design courses fundamentally influences what our students are doing. If 2/3 of all students are basically following exactly what we have designed, of course we also have a core responsibility to make sure that that design is appropriate. And one way to do this is our newly developed learning design tool that we've developed as part of a range of European projects, including Repeat and Teach for Edu. And what you see here is a learning analytics visualization of a learning design approach that we've implemented. And you can get your free account at learning/learningdesign.eu. And if you do this, then you are able to also upload your own course and see how it links to the learning design activities that we've implemented. So what you, for example, see here are a couple of illustrations of how 4 online courses have fundamentally different learning designs, and it's a really cool tool to get get to grips with learning design and also learning analytics. So it's free. We don't have stocks on this, so feel free to use it. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to any questions you might have. And what we do well, what we don't do well at the Open University. And here are my 5 main questions for higher education in the next 5 years based on what I've learned at the Open University and what I've seen across the globe. I think we are now at a stage where we have over 4,500 studies on learning analytics. But I think the next 5 years, we as higher education really need to move from proof of concept to large-scale adoption. And we have, for example, seen at the Open University that that's not a straight line. It's actually quite difficult to get the vast majority of staff using learning analytics. The second big question is how can we provide effective and inclusive personalized learning analytics? So how do we move from providing learning analytics to teachers to really inclusive personalized learning analytics to students? The third fundamental question is about who owns the data. Is it the student? Is it the parent? Is it the institution? Is it the national government, et cetera, et cetera? And what about the ethics of all of this? Fourth, what about the professional development of staff and also our students and learners in order to make sense of all this learning analytics data? And last but not least, there is a tremendous push also in the commercial sector to use analytics. So how can we balance the commercial and higher education interest? So I'm really looking forward. If you have any questions or comments, please email me or just post a message on Twitter. And thank you so much for listening to this talk, and good luck with your conference.
Hello, my name is Associate Professor Linda Corrin, and I'm from Deakin University here in Melbourne. And I'm here today to talk about engaging students and teachers in the development of strategy and practice for learning analytics. I'd like to first start though by thanking the organisers of this Global Human Engagement Conference for the invitation to come and speak to you today. And I'd also like to acknowledge that I am making this recording of this talk on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in Australia. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. So I was really excited to receive the invitation to talk to you today about a topic that's very close to my heart, and that's about having conversations with people across institutions when we're thinking about bringing learning analytics into learning and teaching. So a little bit of background to me, I got involved in this idea of learning analytics, and I'm sure you've heard a couple of people already in this conference talk about the idea of learning analytics, so I'm not going to go into what it is, but I'm just going to tell you a little bit about my history with this. And that was that I started working in the area of learning analytics before it was even known as learning analytics, when I was working at the University of Wollongong, which is here in Australia in New South Wales. And I was working for the medical school there, which was a brand new medical school, and they'd built a new curriculum up from the ground. And the wonderful thing about that was that technology was part of that conversation, and it was really integral to how the curriculum was set up for this medical degree. So that gave us heaps of data. And the really exciting thing about that was that I was working with a colleague of mine, Martin Olmos, and we were playing around with data and saying, well, what can we do with this data that's going to be really useful to us, but also to the teaching staff and to the students to be able to make the best use of this to support student learning and the program as a whole. So we played around with curriculum mapping and we came up with lots of different visualizations. We were able to develop tools like the clinical log so that every time a student had an interaction with a patient, we were able to record that interaction, and the data that came from that helped us to give that information to not only the teachers and the faculty, but also to the students so they could see the breadth and the depth of engagement that they'd had with different clinical presentations and different patients in different clinical settings. And so there were lots of different ways that we were playing around with this data, visualizing this data, trying to look for really educationally meaningful ways of representing this data so that it was useful to the students and the staff within the faculty. But all of this sat within the context of an institution that was still getting its head around what learning analytics was. There was no strategy, there was no policy, there were no procedures that sort of sat around what we were doing. We were really tinkering, and there wasn't a lot that the institution kind of knew about what this was going to be like as we say, 10 years later, or more than 10 years later now. So I guess that's what really instigated my interest in this area of looking at strategy and policy around learning analytics. But in particular, I really wanted to hear from the people who are most affected by the use of learning analytics in institutions. So the question I guess I'm trying to answer in today's presentation is, how do we develop effective strategy for learning analytics practice? And who are some of the people who are really important to that conversation? Now, I'm not going to do every stakeholder that you should talk to if you're thinking about putting learning analytics into your institution. I'm going to focus really on a couple of main areas. But a lot of this came from a paper that I just recently had published in a book with my colleagues Paula DeBarber and Abby Brooker, where we looked at all the different studies that we'd done over the years, where we talked to learners or to students to find out about their expectations when it comes to learning analytics, their interests, the opportunities, the concerns, all the different things that we really need to know about if we're going to develop strategy for learning analytics for practice in our institution. So that paper really focused on the student perspective, but I've also done quite a lot of work on talking to staff about a similar thing as well. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is really just run through a few of these different studies that I've done over the years that show how this conversation has kind of evolved and continued, so that when I've been working in institutions and helping to build strategy for learning analytics, we're able to include the voices of these two really important stakeholders in that conversation. So the first one was when I moved from the University of Wollongong, I came to Melbourne and to the University of Melbourne. One of the first things they asked me to do was to go and talk to teaching staff about what were some of the possibilities that we could do with learning analytics in the institution. And it was a really interesting conversation because again, it was very early days in the learning analytics field, and there wasn't a huge amount of awareness about what analytics could offer and how we could use that to support our students and their learning. But there were 5 main areas that emerged in this conversation with academic staff. The first was student engagement. So there was a lot of staff saying, I want to know about how my students are using the online resources when they're logging in to the learning management system. You know, what sort of behaviours are they doing? When are they participating in discussions, for example, or assessments and things like that. Then there was the idea of performance. So that was very much getting into assessment in more detail. So how were students performing? And also, were there things about their behaviour that might give us an indication of how well their performance will be? So is it that students who perform very well in the first assessment generally do very well by the end of semester? And then how do we pick up and support those students who don't do so well in the first assessment, for example? So there were those sorts of conversations happening as well. But interestingly, and this is really important when we're talking about strategy, is to not just think about something at an individual unit or subject level, but to also think about it a little bit more broadly in terms of the student's journey throughout their entire degree in their university. So the third area was the learning experience. So the teaching staff said, well, what can analytics help us to do to understand not only where are the students now and how are they doing in my class, but where have they come from? What other units have they done previously? What has their journey been? Are they actually repeating this unit because they've already failed it, for example? So there was a lot of different questions there about understanding the pathways that students took through the learning experience, but also how could we help to support and scaffold their learning across their degree program. So what were the things that we needed to really focus on in the early years of their study that we could then develop and then get the students to be a little bit more autonomous as they worked through, so that when they graduate, they're work ready to go out into industry, for example. So there was a lot of interesting conversation around that area as well. There was, of course, a brief conversation about quality of teaching and curriculum. So we do collect lots of data in different ways about whether or not the students are satisfied with the learning and teaching they receive at universities, but also how do we know that, for example, what we're assessing is really assessing the skills that the students need to be able to take forward? How do we align our curriculum with perhaps industry standards or professional society expectations? So how can we use analytics to help us in these sorts of areas? But most interestingly, and this is a theme that you'll see throughout some of the other conversations I'll talk about in our other studies, was that there was a lot of emphasis on the administrative tasks associated with learning and teaching. So the staff sometimes said, well, look, the concept of learning is quite difficult, and translating the data between what I see my students doing and my curriculum and pedagogy is sometimes difficult. But if you could take some of that administrative burden away, so if you could make the analytics useful for generating class lists or helping me track marking of tutors or doing those sorts of things, that will really help me be able to focus more of my time as a teacher on supporting the students and giving them the best educational experience they can have in my subject. So these were some of the things and the conversations that we were having on in the early days. But the problem here was that there wasn't a lot of awareness of the academic staff about what was possible with learning analytics. So some of these conversations were a little bit limited, and we were expecting all these really sophisticated ways that people might want to use analytics, but we found the conversations to be fairly rudimentary in the sense that they didn't know what was possible. They just could talk about the needs that they had or the problems or the pressures that they had in their workload at that time. But one of the questions that kept coming up every time we'd run a focus group with these academic staff was this question of, but what would happen if we gave the data directly to students? Some teachers thought this would be really great. You know, it's their data, they should be able to use it and they should be able to access it and make use of it how they'd like to. But other teachers were a little bit more concerned and wary about whether or not the students would be able to really do something with that data and whether they'd be able to understand it and interpret it within their own study space. So that led us to a student study. And we wanted to talk to students about learning analytics, but of course we didn't think that the students would have had very much exposure to learning analytics previously. So we wanted to give them some kind of representation of their data that we could then discuss with them and have this conversation. Now this study was actually inspired by a Korean study, would you believe, by Park and Jo from 2015. And they did a study where they gave a representation of data. So here's a visualization from that paper. And this was really focused on what the students did, their activity. So how many times they logged in, how long they logged in for, those sorts of things within the learning management system. And this study was really great because they found that the students thought that the analytics that they were given were really helpful for planning their learning schedule, for managing some of their processes around learning, for setting some of the goals that they had for their learning, and also to sort of get an objective perspective on their learning, because you kind of sometimes overestimate, I think, when you're a student, how much time you've spent studying, and it's good to actually be able to see that, for example. But the problem that they did report was that the students said, well, it was all nice to see this behaviour, but it was really difficult for them to translate that into something that they could do to improve their own study strategies and their own learning. And they were really conscious that they didn't want the data like this, so this behavioural data, how many times they logged in, how long, all that sort of thing. They didn't want that to impact their final score and grade. So we used this information and we built our own dashboard. It's only a mock-up dashboard. It's not perfect, but it was just something. So this is one of the dashboards for the biology course. And we decided to take on the feedback from the Korean study to tell us to not focus so much on logins and time online, but to focus on what they actually do when they get online. And of course, how much of the course they've completed, how much there is to go, and other information that might help them to be able to set a standard for their learning and to be able to track their progress over time. So we gave them these dashboards. Now this was, as I said, a fake dashboard, but it was their real data. So when the students who were involved in the study actually saw their dashboard, it was their data from their particular semester study. And we talked to the students at a few different points throughout the semester to get their feedback on not only what they thought of this data, but then what changes did they make to their study or their learning after having seen this data. And there were a few things that we took from this study that I think are really useful, again, for this conversation around strategy. So there was a really big need amongst the student cohort in this study for more support. So the students would look at this data and they'd say, okay, I think I understand this data, or in some cases, actually, I don't understand this data and I need support in interpreting it. But sometimes they needed that extra support also to say, well, if this says that I'm not performing so well in a particular element, what can I do, or what study strategy changes can I make to be able to improve my learning experience and to be able to increase my outcomes in the unit? They really, once they saw a bit of this information, they got really excited about it and they wanted access to more information. So the ability to sort of drill down into some of these elements. So for example, maybe a formative assessment, or in this case being biology, there was practical things that students did and there were different elements that were marked. So they wanted to be able to go in and have a look and get feedback on how well they'd done in certain elements in that particular case. So access to information was really important. One of the things that was really interesting was the students really liked to be able to compare themselves with their peers. And in particular, we threw the class average in there just as a bit of a comparison metric there. And that was really interesting because for some students it was quite motivating. But for other students, when they saw they were just above the class average, they were really excited and, oh, that's great. But that wasn't where they were really aiming for in the first place. They actually wanted to go much higher than that. And so the class average kind of got in their way to some extent. So we had a bit of a conversation at the end of this study about whether or not the class average is actually the right comparison to give to students around their performance. But we also found that diversity in learning design had a huge impact on learning analytics, and that's something, again, we'll come back to. This dashboard you can see here was for the biology course, but we also did it for architecture and Japanese, and very different learning designs, so very different data that we could give to our students. So that study kind of encouraged us to do another study with students, looking at their idea of feedback and how learning analytics might help develop and deliver some feedback to students that could be useful to them. So when we spoke with students about feedback, they were really interested in not just getting the analytics about a mark or a grade, but also getting some really rich feedback in terms of comments and suggestions for improvements. There was lots of different ways that they wanted to look at the focus of the feedback. So some on a particular task, or something that could be a number of tasks and their progress through tasks. So again, there were lots of different ideas around what students wanted in particular around the granularity of the feedback. They really value face-to-face opportunities with staff. So they really want to make sure that analytics is used as a tool, but it's not the only way they get feedback on their learning. And of course, one of the other issues they had around timing and frequency of feedback was making sure that they had enough points throughout a semester where they're able to get feedback, but then also enact that feedback and respond to that feedback in subsequent assessments. So these were all really interesting things that we found out about it. And we actually asked the students in this study to draw a dashboard, if you want to put it that way, or some sort of representation of feedback. And you can see here there are lots of different ways that they represented that, because these students came from across lots and lots of different disciplines. They also came across different year levels, and that was really interesting because feedback needs really changed between year levels. First years, they wanted a lot more support with the teachers, face-to-face, written feedback, but by the later years, they were able to kind of source some of that feedback themselves. There were lots of discipline differences, so different curriculum designs, different learning activities, different assessment types had a big impact there as well. And again, that idea of how do we compare the students' performance to their peers also arose in this study as well. So something for us to think about when we're looking at what we might do across an institution in terms of learning analytics. So the other thing that we did talk about very briefly in another study was around ethics, which is a huge topic, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But what was really interesting in this study was that we found that there was a lack of awareness of the range of data that was collected about students. So we thought students would be pretty savvy about what might be collected about them, but actually they weren't. And they weren't even aware of all of the things that we can even collect through a learning management system. And of course, nowadays we have so many different systems that we use in institutions that collect data across a whole range of areas. And the other thing was that they also felt that a lot of the data was kind of hidden from them, and it perhaps was used by the institution, but it wasn't really used to support them. So they were a little bit skeptical about that data. So including students' voices in these conversations around strategy is really important to break down some of those barriers and that lack of awareness of what we actually do collect and what we do with that data. And that led us to actually put together a white paper that we wrote for the Australian higher education sector on the ethics of learning analytics. So check that out if you're interested in this particular area. But I want to finish off with one final study. I moved from the University of Melbourne to Swinburne University in 2019. And in 2021, I did a study with staff there where, again, I tried to focus in on the teachers' perspectives. And what was interesting is a lot of the same conversations that we'd had in that really early study at the University of Melbourne came through still in our study in Swinburne only a couple of years ago. They were very conscious that there were lots of different systems throwing up data, so we wanted to make sure that we were able to access the data across these systems. There was still a lack of awareness of what the possibilities of learning analytics are. So without knowing what it could do, they were a little bit hesitant to make too many suggestions, but they were enthusiastic to engage with learning analytics. So there's definitely an appetite out there, but they'd like more professional development opportunities and exposure to the possibilities of what we can do with analytics to support student learning. But there was still that theme of the support for administrative functions of teaching, which I found really interesting. They want people to make their jobs easier so they can focus more time on actually supporting their students and dealing with large workloads. And ethics was definitely a theme that came throughout. So we need to make sure that institutions have clear policies around what's appropriate and not appropriate to do with student data and how it can be used in ways that are going to be beneficial to students and staff. So with all of those things said, I guess, and I'm coming back to the paper that I originally started talking about, I guess there's three areas that really come to mind when we talk about the importance of these conversations with staff and students. And the first is when we're talking about strategy with these people, we need to make sure that they have an awareness of what's possible. So they've got to understand what kind of applications are out there so that they can have a meaningful conversation with us about strategy. We also need to understand more about the relationship between data and learning. So what can data tell us about how students learn? Data is very behavioural and it doesn't always equate directly to learning. So we need to understand more about that, and staff and teachers need to understand that, and students need to understand that too. And we need to be quite transparent about the processes and procedures that we use the data for within institutions. But I guess one of the biggest things from this is to continually have these conversations. So when you build a strategy, it's not we've had the conversation, we've built the strategy and that's it. It needs to be a continued conversation with staff and students as the strategy continues to be rolled out throughout the institution and as learning analytics continues to develop over time. Speaking of time, that is my time, that's my 20 minutes. So I hope that's been useful to you. I'm very happy to follow up with anybody after the session if you'd like to learn anything more about the research that informed this particular presentation. You can contact me on my email address here, and I'm also available on Twitter at Linda Corrin. Thank you again to the organisers of this conference for the opportunity to speak to you all, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Hello everybody, my name's Nigel Guenole and I'm going to be talking to you today about applications of artificial intelligence and talent management, and it's great to be talking at the Global Human Engagement Conference with you today. The basis for this talk is going to be two papers that I've written, one in 2017, which was the business case for artificial intelligence and human resources, and I wrote that with my colleague at the time, Sherry Feinzig, about the way IBM implemented artificial intelligence across its human resources systems. The second paper that I'm going to talk about is one that I wrote last year with Professor Andy Charlwood from University of Leeds, and that was a more critical academic perspective on some of the challenges facing organizations that decide to implement artificial intelligence and their human resource systems. So the first paper really will cover the first 10 minutes of this conversation, which will talk about the things that are getting organizations and practitioners excited. And then the second part will be a more critical perspective, which are the things that we need to think about if we're going to implement artificial intelligence fairly in organizations. So the first thing I'd like to note is that artificial intelligence is in human resources is big business. And I have a few statistics here that will really underscore this. So first of all, there are hundreds of companies, HR technology startups and bigger firms that are investing in artificial intelligence tools to manage talent in their organization, to get the right people in the right places at the right time. Some examples are Eightfold, an AI-based talent intelligence platform, raised $220 million US and has recently been valued at over $2 billion. Phenom automates job tasks and it improves the job search experience. And it was recently reported that this company had quietly become a billion-dollar unicorn. Accenture has invested in the recruitment tech firm Beamery, and that has a reported valuation of $800 million. And IBM reported that in a single year, in the paper that I mentioned on the previous slide, their savings due to implementation of artificial intelligence exceeded $100 million. So you can see why there is a lot of interest. There is a lot of interest in this technology. But what exactly do we mean by artificial intelligence in the context of talent management? Well, we mean the use of technology to create systems capable of performing tasks in the human resources arena thought to require human intelligence. In HR, these advances have mainly occurred in the area of machine learning, and machine learning is a subdiscipline of artificial intelligence where systems get better really at what they were designed to do through experience by learning from data. And it often involves making predictions or making classifications, such as who is going to be a strong job performer or who is likely to leave an organization, who is likely to leave their job. So practitioners are getting excited, more so than the researchers. The practitioners are getting excited for a few different reasons. The claim from vendors and the organizations that are behind these AI systems are, first of all, that AI helps you solve business problems in disrupted business environments. So perhaps you want to land and expand in a new geography and you don't have the technical or the human capabilities on the ground to be able to resource that and do the recruiting. Well, you could use artificial intelligence. So AI gets the right skills in the right place, and it can help you keep your skills of the workforce modern rather than letting them become obsolete. Organizations are also claiming that it allows them to provide employees technology experience at work with the systems that they need to interact with that mirrors their home experience, such as Amazon or Netflix. The AI is also being used to provide real-time decision support to help people execute their work more efficiently and more effectively, so we get them the knowledge that they need when they need it. And it also helps HR managers and HR leaders demonstrate strong accountability for their budgets, for their spends in an increasingly cost-conscious environment. So now I'll talk about a few of the applications. I think 3 or 4 of the applications I'll talk about here, but there are many more in the paper, the business case for artificial intelligence and human resources. So the first application is candidate attraction. So there are claims by organizations that when they implement chatbots into their recruiting pages, they get a 3x uplift in the number of qualified candidates that apply for their jobs. And these chatbots can answer simple questions like, are there jobs available for people who can code in Python? And they can also answer more complex questions related to the culture of the organization, for instance. What would it be like to work around here? Would I need to work hybrid? Would I be able to work remotely, or do I need to come into the office? So these chatbots being implemented in the candidate attraction phase is one strong application of artificial intelligence in human resources. Another application is recruiting. So in that paper that I'm referring to several times now, IBM shows that they receive 7,000 applications per day. That's 7,000 applications per day. And recruiters, unaided by technology, are not going to be able to spend a lot of time on those applications when the volume gets so high. So what can you do? Well, you can implement AI systems that can scan the job requisition, then scan the resumes of the candidates and match the candidates to the resumes based on the overlap between the skills reported and the skills required. Now, the important thing about this is that the AI scores that are given to candidates have been shown to correlate very highly with the scores that recruiters give when they spend a long time evaluating the resumes. So the scores that the AI gives correlate really strongly with performance. And organizations that have implemented this sort of technology have shown that the time to hire has halved. So time to get somebody in the organization working has halved due to implementation of this kind of technology in the recruiting space. Another application is compensation decision making. So the important thing that we talk about in the paper that I mentioned is that this is human in the loop decision making. So the manager can always override the recommendation, but a recommendation is given regarding a compensation decision for candidates. Now, the reason that artificial intelligence and machine learning is particularly powerful here is because the decision is getting much more complex with regard to what a reward should be. And that's because it's no longer just the case that you consider performance when you're considering somebody's remuneration. You also have to consider external labor market factors, for instance, about the scarcity of the skills in the market currently, and also the likelihood that those skills are going to become more in demand or less in demand in the near future. So when the decisions become much more complex, it's much better to do this algorithmically, and you can actually simplify the process quite considerably when the organizations get to sizes of, say, 100,000 people or more. The amount of time that it takes when you can make recommendations to managers versus leaving them to their own devices to make it is dramatically reduced. So those are some of the applications where artificial intelligence is being used, but what are some of the concerns? Well, one of the concerns is that AI will either eliminate work or it will degrade the quality of work. So how will it degrade the quality of work? Well, the main way is by introducing a world of surveillance where everybody is surveilled and watched very closely at work, and we'll see a couple of examples. Another is unresolved questions around fairness. There are many unresolved questions around fairness about whether different demographic groups receive opportunities at the same rates, and whether the artificial intelligence systems reinforce existing societal biases and scale those biases. There are also questions around AI suitability for particular tasks. And I will say in the coming slides that the AI is really good at the organizing side of recruiting, attraction, and selection, but as things stand, it's not so good for the actual psychological measurements when we're trying to measure people's skills. So talking about the degradation of work, the broad concern here is that artificial intelligence will facilitate a world where everybody is watched and surveilled constantly at work. And here are some examples of where that's already happening. Bars and restaurants are starting to use their security cameras to feed AIs that monitor and manage the performance of their workers. Hospitals are starting to use algorithm-based systems to prioritize and allocate nursing tasks. Amazon has recently started to roll out the use of AI-linked cameras to monitor the activities of delivery workers. And the big question really here is relates to the philosophy of the developers of the artificial intelligence systems. Is their aim to replace the workers, or is their aim to surveil the workers, or is their aim to augment the capability of the workers to do their work? And there are cases that you can make supporting each of those different positions, but at the end of the day, that's a values judgment, and values are really important in deciding how we go about implementing artificial intelligence. The next question is fairness or bias, and this is a really big one. And here is how you can think about it. When there are differences in the rates of opportunities, employment-related opportunities that different groups receive, say men or women, we call this adverse impact. This is called adverse impact. And in terms of the causes of that adverse impact, the causes may be firstly that there are genuine differences. And perhaps there are genuine differences between the men or the women. On the other hand, perhaps the artificial intelligence systems are mismeasuring. Maybe they're mismeasuring women or other ethnic minority groups, perhaps. And if they're mismeasuring, we call that bias. But if they're not mismeasuring and the differences reflect real differences between the groups, we call that adverse impact. So I'm a psychologist, that's the psychological perspective. Computer scientists, on the other hand, call both cases bias. And many people agree that whether there are differences in the rates at which different groups receive employment-related opportunities, this is an undesirable outcome. However, not everybody agrees. And whether that's fair or not, again, is a values-based question. And because it's a values-based question, is this fair, is this not fair? Some people might agree that it's fair, some people might not, and it doesn't really have a technical solution. This is not an easy problem to solve, but it's not a new problem either. The scale and speed, however, with which AI systems make these decisions means that the problem is more challenging now than it has been in the past, when we just had, say, paper-based employment testing to see who gets a job and who doesn't get a job. Just a couple of examples of where the computer scientists and the psychologists have a different view on bias. Here are a couple of quotes from the New York Times. In the first, a company says, "We test the algorithms to ensure that women and men, as well as people of different ethnic backgrounds, are getting similar scores. And if they aren't, we adjust the inputs until they are." So they're not really giving much consideration to whether the differences that are observed by the AI system are real or not real. They're just changing them until the scores are equal. Now, psychologists wouldn't do that, but the computer scientists do that kind of thing. In a second quote, X is the first hiring platform designed entirely around the psychology of decision-making that helps firms make recruitment decisions smart, i.e. predictive of performance, fair, less biased, and easy. So you can see people are equating the notion of fair, which is the social judgment, with less bias, which is a technical consideration. So this is something to look out for when you're talking to computer scientists and machine learners and psychologists about what we mean by bias, because we often mean different things. So there are different disciplines, computer science and psychology, and they have different strategies for how we will resolve this challenge. Psychologists want to accurately measure people's skills. They want to build tests to minimize bias. So they want to measure as accurately as possible, and they try to influence those selection rates separately. So if we find a measure that has bias, that measures differently for the different groups, we will try to either fix that measure or use an alternative measure. The machine learning community focuses on eliminating the impact which they call bias directly in their algorithms. So some of the things that the psychologists will do to minimize that impact and increase fairness is they might change the predictors. So instead of using cognitive ability, which we know shows adverse impact often, we might use an alternative predictor such as personality, which doesn't show adverse impact. They might broaden the outcome that we're trying to predict. So if you're trying to predict the quantity of work that somebody does, then often you will have to use a predictor that has a lot of bias, or has a lot of adverse impact, I should say. But if we predict not only the quantity of work that people do, but how they go about doing that work, in that case, then we can often use predictors that are known to have less adverse impact, such as personality. They will also use score banding, and score banding is when we treat scores that are not exactly the same, but are similar as being the same. And this, under certain conditions, can reduce adverse impact. Then there is affirmative action approaches and equal employment opportunity approaches, where there are light touch approaches where we can just advertise in areas where we know minority groups will read job ads to get more people to the starting line. And we can also have more interventionist approaches where minority groups get an advantage of some sort in the selection process. The artificial intelligence and machine learning community do things slightly differently. It's much more data focused. So they have pre-processing approaches where they take the data and they may remove the protected attribute, gender, say, from a model. They may re-estimate models by relabeling. They may, for instance, change the number of minority groups who have lower performing outcomes. They may just change that so that the lower performing, a proportion of the lower performing group have higher job performance scores. They can also introduce training time constraints, and training time constraints really just constrain the prediction so that the job offers, or the people who are considered likely to be successful candidates, are balanced across the two different groups. And then they have techniques such as post-processing, and with post-processing, this is similar to the banding approach that the psychologists will use. They will treat scores that are similar, but not exactly the same, as effectively being the same. So the machine learning approaches are much more data focused, where the psychology approaches are much more content focused. So why are there differences? Why are there differences between machine learning and psychological approaches to error? Well, the main reason is that in the traditional approaches of machine learning, measurement error is often ignored because it hasn't been relevant. It's easy to tell whether there is a cat in the picture or whether a car drove over the edge of the line. However, when we're talking about the performance of people, it's a very different situation. Whether I performed well on a job over a given period depends on the period that you consider. It depends on who you ask about my performance. It depends on many different issues. So measurement error is very is pervasive in human resources research. So while it has been the exception in machine learning and computer science, has been the rule really in psychological sciences and human resources. And this is a nice quote from Mullainathan and Obermeyer that really emphasizes that measurement error in machine learning is not something that's considered to the same depth as it is in psychology. So what can human resources professionals do in order to cope with that? Well, I make 3 recommendations here that will really help position organizations well if they want to implement artificial intelligence solutions. And the first is to design artificial intelligence systems. If you're going to design artificial intelligence systems that will affect a particular group, design them with the involvement of the group that's going to be affected by the system. So this is the idea of doing things with people rather than doing things to people. The second thing that people should do is have multidisciplinary teams. Have technology teams and social teams, psychologists, sociologists, economists even, working together rather than working separately. You really do need these different perspectives. And the third recommendation that I would make is to spend a lot of time aligning on values. So what is it that we want to achieve collectively through the implementation of these artificial intelligence systems? Because until we align on these values, we are not going to be able to chart a way forward that meets the needs of all of our different stakeholders. So that's it. Thank you for your time today, and I'd welcome your comments. You can email me at my email address there. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Amy Reschly. I'm a professor and department head of educational psychology at the University of Georgia in the United States. I'm so thankful for the opportunity to speak with you as part of the Global Human Engagement Conference. I'm contributing to Session 2, Student Engagement. In 2012, my close friend and colleague Sandra Christensen and I published a chapter in the Handbook of Research on Student Engagement, which we also co-edited. In this chapter, and in the handbook in general, we identified what we saw as the current status, issues, and future directions of the student engagement construct. Just over 10 years later, we've published a second edition of this handbook and revisited these issues and status of the field. I'll be drawing from this work in my talk today. There is considerable international interest in student engagement, and of course, it's not surprising why. Student engagement is associated with important proximal and distal outcomes of interest that cross the span of schooling from early elementary school through college age. These outcomes include students' academic achievement, lower risk health and sexual behaviors, social emotional well-being, and long-term outcomes such as work success. In addition, student engagement is thought to be associated with resilience to threats to development and is alterable, that is to say, it can be influenced by changes in context and through intervention. That leads us to this question: what is student engagement? There's something very practical and tangible about student engagement. As educators and scholars, we know what engaged students look like. If pressed to describe that, we might say engaged students show up, they participate, they show interest, they like school, or in other words, that student engagement involves some aspects of students' emotion, cognition, and behavior. It is when we further operationalize this construct that we see differences in how student engagement is defined and measured. Student engagement is a multidisciplinary construct, and so as part of that, I want to briefly describe 3 areas of scholarship that contributed to the current field of student engagement. Understanding these origins helps lay the groundwork for understanding current issues in the field. The 3 areas that I'm going to talk about are the tradition of research in on-task or academic engaged time, dropout prevention and school completion, and student engagement as a meta-construct and school reform initiatives. Beginning with time on task and academic engaged time, John Carroll delineated 5 classes of variables that accounted for student achievement. He described aptitude as the amount of time needed to learn, opportunity to learn, or the amount of time that was allocated for learning, perseverance, or how much time a student was willing to devote to learning. This captured their motivation, the quality of instruction students received, and the ability to understand instruction. These latter 2 variables, the quality of instruction and ability to understand, have an inverse association with time, such that poor quality of instruction or lower ability to understand instruction results in a student requiring more time required to learn. Similarly, higher quality instruction or a student with higher ability require less time to learn. Perhaps what was most novel about this model of learning is that it drew attention to characteristics of individual learners, such as their aptitude, their ability to understand, and their motivation. It also brought our attention to the instructional context in terms of how time is allocated for learning and the quality of instruction that's provided to students, and importantly, the interaction between student and context in producing learning. So these concepts, context, existence of individual differences, and the interaction and fit between the two really endure and remain in our current broader conceptualizations of student engagement as both a meta-construct and those variables are well suited to intervention purposes. There has been research on time and achievement for over 100 years. In general, the more time students spend engaged in academic activities, the more they learn, or the higher their achievement. Dr. Mary Beth Gettinger did excellent work in this area in describing this academic learning time continuum. Each level of this continuum could be an appropriate focus of intervention for enhancing students' learning. Available instructional time is the broadest sense of time. This refers to the number of hours in a school day or the number of days in an academic year. Efforts to lengthen the school year, for example, are trying to increase the amount of time that is available to learn. Anyone who's ever been in more than one classroom knows that time is used differently across educators. Some have excellent classroom and instructional management and are able to effectively maximize the amount of time that's used for learning in their classrooms. Time is limited and it's important. As such, there are many interventions that target increasing productive instructional time by things like improving individual classroom and behavior management, enhancing the quality of instruction, and improving climate and relationships to enhance students' academic engagement, and in turn, their achievement. Engaged time is frequently measured in classroom observational systems and is used as a target of interventions at the individual, small group, and classroom levels. The final distinction here is that not all engaged time is created equal. For example, students may appear to be engaged in academic activities during instruction or school, but those activities may not be relevant to the topic or could be at the wrong academic level for their learning, either being too easy or too hard. And thus, the sweet spot or the best type of academic engaged time is that it's at the appropriate level. Now, this work is clearly related to current student engagement conceptualizations. First, time and how it is used is alterable. Second, the role of context and influence students' engagement, individual differences, and there's an interaction between students and context, and linking students' involvement and participation in academic tasks and activities to their achievement and long-term outcomes. However, as it became available or very clear to us in the dropout literature, is that academic engagement or academic engaged time alone are not enough to accomplish the broader goals of schooling or to re-engage students who are at greatest risk of dropping out of high school. Thus, we shift now to expanded views of student engagement that emerge from the dropout prevention and school reform literatures. One major impetus to the study of student engagement comes from the high school dropout literature. Student engagement is central to how we conceptualize the processes of dropping out and successful school completion in both the high school and the college literatures on this topic. It should be noted that the early focus in the high school literature was really on the idea of disengagement rather than engagement. The shift toward the positive end of the spectrum is reflected in more current work with a broader trend in positive psychology and indicators of health and wellness. In reading the high school literature, there are several enduring principles in how we conceptualize student engagement and dropout. Disengagement that leads to dropout is viewed as a long-term process. Students don't just wake up one morning and drop out of high school. There were warning signs and indicators along the way. In addition, students' engagement is affected by the context, in this case, school policies and practices. Here, as with academic engaged time, there is a role for context and interventions that target school context and classroom environment. Students' engagement and disengagement may vary across a school day. A student might be disengaged in one task or subject, but not others, or they may be disengaged more broadly. And as all dropout researchers note, there are no simple or easy fixes for dropout, because this phenomenon reflects multiple and systemic influences that lead to that event. The most influential theory in the high school dropout literature is the participation identification model proposed by Jeremy Finn. Finn conceptualized engagement as including students' behavior and in terms of an emotional component, in this case their identification with school. Finn described a process that began with participation in school and activities, the experience of success, and subsequent identification with school and learning, which then facilitated their ongoing participation. This participation, success, identification cycle sustains most students through to graduation, despite occasional setbacks. For students who are at risk of disengagement and dropout, however, the cycle becomes one of disengagement and withdrawal. Finn drew attention to the time period before school entry in that some students may not have the experiences, either at home or in early childhood programs, that prepare them for successful participation when they arrived at school. He also noted there were greater opportunities for students to participate as they age. So the requirements for successful participation change, such that successful participation is different for a fourth grader than it is for a kindergartner. However, there are also more opportunities for students through extracurricular activities, school clubs, and so forth. This model gave us a way to conceptualize disengagement and dropout, but notably, it also conceptualized the process of engagement that resulted in a positive outcome of high school completion. Dropout researchers were increasingly noting that whole school reforms and initiatives were needed to address students' disengagement. In the early 2000s, interest in student engagement was spilling into other related areas. There were two seminal publications in 2004 that illustrate this broad and growing interest in student engagement. The first of these was published by the National Research Council and was entitled Engaging Schools, Fostering High School Students' Motivation to Learn. The Academy panel was an esteemed group of scholars with expertise in motivation, child development, school reform, and school climate, among other things. The panel noted the declining motivation and engagement that occurs as students progress from elementary to secondary schools and offered recommendations in curriculum, instruction, and organization of schools. Recommendations were centered around self-determination theory, or the idea of how we would engender ideas of I can, I want to, and I belong in our students. The book also noted that engagement was necessary for learning, relevant for all students, and protective for those at greatest risk for poor academic outcomes. The book also highlights what is an enduring controversy in this field. That is, what is this distinction between motivation and student engagement? In this volume, the terms were used interchangeably. The second seminal publication that year was by Jennifer Fredericks and colleagues. The authors described student engagement as comprised of three dimensions: behavior, emotion, and cognition. These three dimensions remain the primary conceptualizations of student engagement among scholars today. Behavioral engagement was defined in terms of participation in academic, social, and extracurricular activities, which were recognized as necessary for academic success and dropout prevention activities. Emotional engagement referred to positive and negative reactions to teachers, classmates, academics, and school, which then promotes students' willingness to complete academic tasks. Lastly, cognitive engagement, drawing from work and motivation, was described in terms of investment and related to students' willingness to exert effort necessary to comprehend complex ideas and master difficult skills. These three dimensions or subtypes were the primary categorization endorsed by scholars in the first edition of this handbook and remain so in the second edition. One of the most compelling things about this work is the argument that student engagement, conceptualized in this way, allows for a more complex and nuanced understanding of students and their experiences at school. However, it further exacerbated questions about the associations between motivation and student engagement, particularly among the subtype of cognitive engagement and academic motivation. The view that student engagement is the basis of high school reform allows us to think more comprehensively or broadly about students' engagement. So it has always been the basis of our most promising dropout interventions, so something that we would think of more at a targeted or intensive levels. But here this allowed us to shift further and broader to what is it that we do for all students to help engender feelings of I can, I want to, and I belong. Things like freshman academies, district advisement programs, changes to curricula. Now, if we take a developmental perspective that's offered from the dropout literature, we can connect our efforts to enhance students' engagement across school levels, from elementary school through college. We can also think about engagement systemically at the school or district level. Student engagement offers a unifying framework for interventions and a unifying goal. We want to be able to promote school completion with competence and prepare students to be well-functioning members of society. Understanding the different scholarly traditions and history of student engagement provides a background for one of our enduring issues in this field. This is how we define and operationalize student engagement. We've used this term, jingle jangle, to reflect this issue. There is broad or general agreement on the dimensions of emotion, cognition, and behavior. Otherwise, the field is rife with confusion regarding terms about what is and what is not included in the framework of student engagement. This confusion is also reflected in how scholars refer to the broad field or construct. Although student engagement is the most widely used term, others use the term school engagement or academic engagement. Now, academic engagement is somewhat problematic as the term for this global construct, in my view, because of the scholarly tradition that examines academic engagement as engaged time. Furthermore, we have argued that student engagement is a preferred term because it is students who are engaged or disengaged at school and with learning. Schools, classrooms, and teachers affect students' engagement, but students are the focus. When it comes to subtypes and indicators, there is still much variability across scholars. One scholar's indicator of cognitive engagement is another's indicator of affective engagement. Behavioral engagement might be narrowly defined as participation in class, or it may also include school conduct, or what students do outside of school in terms of homework, and in some cases, their extracurricular participation. Affective engagement, by this token, may refer to emotional states, or more broadly to belongingness or connectedness, and or relationships with teachers, peers. And then cognitive engagement in some cases is narrowly defined as learning strategy use, and other situations might be motivation, self-regulation, effort, or relevance to the future, or how students view how relevant their education is to their future. The terms or concepts that are particularly difficult to classify in student engagement are things like flow, utility, effort, interest, and investment. However, given the broad fields that student engagement draws from, we probably shouldn't be surprised that there are so many conceptualizations. In addition, student engagement is thought to be comprised of interrelated thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that indicate the complexity of the human experience and how difficult it is to separate these aspects of the student or human experience. Student engagement is probably best thought of as a broad framework for conceptualizing student school experiences and interventions. The literature currently doesn't suggest that one conceptualization is better or more supported than another. Rather, it indicates the need to be very specific and precise in our terminology so that we may evaluate and compare results across studies. The association or distinction between motivation and engagement is one of the thorniest and most controversial issues in this field. In the second edition of our handbook, it was clear that scholars continue to wrestle with this distinction. As I noted before, many conceptualizations of student engagement subsume motivation as one of the lines of research, with belonging, extracurricular participation, attendance, etc., and motivational terms or constructs overlap in particular with what is thought of as cognitive engagement. Sometimes scholars use these terms synonymously or interchangeably. The view here is more practical in that scholars and educators figure that both are important in practice, so why spend time differentiating the two? Understandably, motivational researchers and theorists view engagement much more narrowly, and this typically as the outcome of motivation. However, motivational scholars have also warned of the motivational literature becoming too fragmented, and by the same token, student engagement cannot be everything to everyone. Eccles and Wang noted this tension, describing that broad conceptualizations are useful for communicating with stakeholders and others, whereas narrow conceptualizations, such as those often endorsed in the motivational field, are useful for research and theory testing. As an engagement researcher, I want to underscore how useful I find the framework for student engagement for conceptualizing and communicating interactions among contexts and individuals, and how engagement relates to student outcomes, and the role of developmental processes, that this framework allows for rich characterizations of student school experiences and for a way of thinking about comprehensive and systemic interventions. In this way, this motivational versus engagement distinction, I think, is perhaps one of focus. broad integrated theories of student engagement draw from developmental theory and take more of a life course perspective and have often broader outcome measures, whereas motivational research tends to view engagement more narrowly and focus on achievement as an outcome. One better distinction might be, perhaps, between that of taking a developmental view on student engagement and a motivational one. I also want to highlight recent work by Skinner and Rain, in which they review and suggest ways in which motivation and engagement literatures can complement and strengthen the other. Another controversy or point to clarify in this field is whether scholars conceptualize student engagement and disengagement as being on a single continuum that ranges from low to high, or whether engagement and disengagement or disaffection are fundamentally different from having low student engagement. Increasingly, scholars are examining these as two separate continua, where you have one continuum of engagement and one of disaffection or burnout. The increasing consensus that being disaffected or burned out is different from being low engagement raises other questions. It is unclear what the dimensions are of disaffection. Does it also have emotional, cognitive, and behavioral components? And where would certain indicators that have been traditionally part of the engagement construct be included, such as things like disciplinary incidents or skipping classes? Katrina Samello-Aro has been investigating disaffection in terms of burnout, which draws from the adult workplace literature. But however, this makes it unclear how burnout applies to younger children. Please allow me to summarize some of the big ideas about student engagement. Student engagement is of interest across disciplines and internationally. It is a construct or framework that interests both researchers and practitioners. There is agreement that engagement is a construct that's relevant for all students across the span of schooling, not just those who are at risk for poor educational outcomes. Student engagement is also thought to promote resilience in the face of significant threats to development and education. Students' engagement is associated with short and long-term outcomes of interest across academic, behavioral, and social-emotional domains, and even predicts long-term outcomes like work success. There has been considerable progress in the last 10 years in terms of measurement, intervention, and longitudinal studies, and there is common ground regarding the broad domains of students' engagement as being comprised of emotion, cognition, and behavior. However, some questions remain, in particular, how scholars define and measure students' engagement, the model they espouse, and the level at which engagement is studied, meaning at the individual, classroom, school, etc. There is currently not evidence to suggest one model or conceptualization is better than another. Rather, authors must be precise in their language, providing information in how they are defining and measuring student engagement so that we can continue to advance the field. I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I have provided my email address here if you would like to contact me, and my references are included on the final slide. Thank you so much.
Hello from Sydney, Australia. I'd like to use my time today to talk about the purpose or the functions of student engagement in a classroom context. But before I do so, I'd like to say thank you to Minji Son, for inviting me to the Global Engagement Conference. Really appreciate that. I'd also like to acknowledge my 3 collaborators who will be with me in spirit on this talk. Interesting, all 3 are Korean. Sung-Hyung Chan, he's at Korea University in Seoul. Jeong, Jeong, she's at Hanyang University, also in Seoul. And Hae-Deok Jeong from Australian Catholic University. She's here with me in Sydney. We work together at ACU. Let me start with definition of engagement, traditional definition. You can see it up in the top left. Students' active involvement in a learning activity. This is a standard definition. I think it's descriptive, however. Just about everyone would agree with it. This is Ellen Skinner's definition, Jennifer Frederick, a lot of people who study engagement. And the point is that if you just, you're a teacher, you're watching your students, you're trying to determine who's highly engaged, who's moderately engaged, who's lowly engaged. It's not that hard. You observe them, who's working in these 4 ways. You can be like the 2 elementary school girls in the photograph here. You can be behaviorally engaged, which means you're working to capacity, you're working hard, effort. You can be emotionally engaged, which means you're working enthusiastically and with interest. You can be cognitively engaged, which means you're working strategically or using sophisticated learning strategies. And the fourth way you can be actively engaged is be agentically engaged, which means you're working proactively and a lot of initiative and showing input and constructive contribution into your own learning. So that's a traditional way of looking at engagement. But I'm a little bit unsatisfied with that definition because engagement is so full of purpose. We need to go beyond what it is and ask why people are engaged. What's the purpose or the function of student engagement? And to me, it's full of purpose. As students what they're trying to do is make progress. They're trying to do, they're trying to be able to do tomorrow what they cannot yet do today. That's what achievement and learning is. I'm trying to learn a foreign language, and I don't understand it today, but I'll master it in a few weeks. Or I'm trying to develop some particular skill, like jump roping, or I'm trying to become a better writer. I'm trying to make progress. And how do I do that? I engage myself behaviorally, emotionally, cognitively, agentically. But you can see it's more than that. We're going to try to use engagement to satisfy your own motivations, motivational satisfactions, and we're going to use engagement to recruit a supportive learning environment for ourselves. And that's going to be our third function of engagement I'll get to today. Okay, let me start with purpose number one. This is what everybody thinks about. Gail Sinatra called it the holy grail of learning is engagement. So the idea is the more engaged you are, the more you learn, the more you achieve, the more academic progress you make. That there's a relationship, not just a correlation, but some kind of causality that if you change engagement, increase engagement, you'll change or increase progress or achievement. What do we mean by achievement? We mean learning, we mean skill and talent, maybe graduation, things like this. But let me be a skeptic for a second and say, is that arrow really warranted? Does a change in engagement really explain, predict, cause a change in achievement? So here's a couple of our early studies that give me a little bit of doubt on this conclusion. This study with Korean students on the left. It's a structural equation modeling, basically a multiple regression where the outcome is achievement. In this case, it's just course grades, cross-sectional study. And we use the four indicators of agency, behavioral, emotional, and cognitive engagement as four predictors controlling for a grade level and gender and things like that. And you can see that agentic engagement and behavioral engagement have green circles, it means they're significant independent predictors. But emotional engagement, cognitive engagement do not contribute unique variance to explain achievement. So it's a partial answer. Like it looks like agency and behavioral engagement, effort and initiative do correspond to gains in achievement, whereas enthusiasm and learning strategies do not. And we've actually found this several times. And the next study, this is a contemporary study, a very, very large sample. It's a study in engagement the way I think it ought to be studied, not cross-sectionally, but longitudinally and reciprocally with other constructs. So in this study, we tracked students over a semester. And what we find is engagement is a poor predictor of growth or change in achievement. You can see it, how engaged you are at the first of the semester. It's not a good predictor of midterm achievement. That's that 0.02. The dashed line means it's not significant. And then it's a mild positive, significant predictor. Change in engagement at midterm predicts end of course achievement. That's the 0.10 beta weight. Significant, but pretty moderate, pretty mild. Not a holy grail of learning there. But interesting, the other path is quite strong. Achievement's a very good predictor of a change or growth in engagement, both at the first half of the semester and in the second half of the semester. These are the 0.35 and the 0.39. So put these two studies together and some other studies, And you start to get the idea that, sure, engagement and achievement are correlated. They're certainly associated. They go together. But it could be that achievement's driving engagement more than vice versa. So we may be overestimating this effect. But I do want to say, I think it's there. I just think it's mild, and I think it's limited, both to agency and behavioral. And I question the independent contribution of emotion and cognition. But I'll get to that as we go. So why do people care so much about student engagement? So here are my 3 reasons why we should care as much. The first one is the answer I always get. I see the blue circle, that A, and that's what I just showed you, that people presume that engagement is a good predictor of achievement or academic progress or learning or something like that. But the other 2 functions that are more specific to agentic engagement, but all of engagement, I'll try to make this case as I go. You see the blue circle with B, that the more initiative and proactive I am, the more I try to contribute into my own learning and make suggestions and offer input. That's agency. It brings out greater autonomy support from my teacher. So I get more autonomy support and less control. I get a more supportive learning environment for myself. So my math teacher, my foreign language teacher, takes my perspective, supports my interest more, etc. And the C, the other blue circle, is that the more engaged I am, the more likely I am to experience motivational satisfactions during the learning. I'll give you lots of examples, but a simple one is if I'll make the effort to read a book, then it's more likely I'll satisfy my curiosity or satisfy my interest, etc. So these are the 3 functions that I like to emphasize today. So we've talked about number 1, engagement's a moderate predictor of achievement. But what about the other 2 functions? So here's some of our logic. On the left is one of our early studies with Korean high school students. What we found is, we were just studying agency here, how much initiative and proactivity and input the student showed at the first of the semester predicted growth, improvement, longitudinal change in how autonomy support the teacher was. That's that green circle, 0.330 beta weight. And then if for whatever reason the student becomes more agentically engaged during the semester at time 2, then the teacher also becomes perceived as more autonomy supported by the end of the semester. That's at 0.23 beta weight. So this is a sign that by being agentically engaged, students are pulling out, recruiting greater autonomy support from their teacher, which is a tremendous asset for the students to have, as I'll talk about a little bit later. And then another study on the right by Lenny and Matos. This is actually in Peru rather than Korea, but no surprise, under time 1, the green circle, perceived autonomy support, predicts all aspects of student engagement. 33, 40, 29, 33 beta weights predicts all aspects of engagement because autonomy support is very powerful. But if you look at the reverse causation, reciprocal relation, you see only agentic engagement predicts the growth in autonomy support. That's that circle 0.18. And cognitive, emotional, and behavioral aren't independent predictors. But it's still agentic engagement or engagement as a larger latent construct are recruiting greater autonomy support from the teacher. And just to give some words or some classroom dynamics to it, so you can see the classroom dynamic rather than numbers. So on the left is what the agentically engaged student says and does during instruction. And on the right is what autonomy supportive teachers say and do during instruction. And the green arrow means that it's a reciprocal. The more agentically engaged I am as a student, the more I let my teacher know what I want and need and what I'm interested in, the more likely it is that the teacher will take my perspective and invite me to pursue my personal interests and my personal goals, and this is perspective taking and support for intrinsic motivation are really central concepts in autonomy support. And then the more autonomy supported the teacher is, the green line goes back and it pulls out agentic engagement. So you can see this reciprocal causation going back and forth. As what I'm trying to say is these students are creating more motivationally satisfying learning environments for themselves through agency, through agentic engagement. Then the third function, so it says function 1 up there, it should be function 3. Engagement predicts motivational satisfactions. So what explains goal attainment and value and self-efficacy and need satisfaction and intrinsic motivation, etc.? One very good predictor is how autonomy supportive the teacher is, and that's on the left. I'm going to talk about the study on the right more, but just to make the case, where do motivational satisfactions come from? And if you have a really supportive teacher, you'll probably have pretty high quality motivation. And what the graphs show, this is our, if people know some of my research, then you'll know I do a lot of randomized control trials with autonomy supportive teaching. So the blue line are teachers who go through a workshop with us to learn how to become more autonomy supportive at the first of the semester or year. And then the red line is a control group, practice as usual, motivating style. And what all three graphs say are the same thing. If I have an autonomy supportive teacher, the teacher becomes more autonomy supportive during the academic year, then I experience during the class, during math or during language or PE, I experience more autonomy, more competence, and more relatedness satisfaction during class. So that's one way you create motivational satisfaction, is you have an autonomy supportive teacher. But over on the right is another twist on this, and the students create their own motivational satisfaction through their own engagement. So here's a reciprocal study. So you can see motivation influencing engagement, engagement influencing motivation. And what's striking about the figure is that the reciprocal relationship is pretty strong, which means, what everybody knows, motivation predicts engagement. That's that 0.24 and the 0.36 beta weights. But engagement also predicts growth, longitudinal change in motivation. If I'm highly engaged at the first of the semester, I have more motivation, more high quality motivation at midterm. That's that 0.17. And then if I become more engaged during the semester, then I become more motivated by the end of the year. That's that 0.27. Of course, it works the other way. If I become less engaged, then I have lower quality motivation at the end of the semester. But the conclusion in the bottom of the slide here is, yes, motivation predicts engagement, but the opposite is true. Engagement's a very good, very strong predictor of achievement. So if I seek out an optimal challenge, engagement, then I probably grow my sense of competence. If I initiate a conversation, a relationship with a classmate, then I'm more likely to experience relatedness satisfaction. Except we can come up with lots of examples of that, but or how about the opposite would be if I'm passive during class, I don't seek out optimal challenges and read the book and things like this, then I go home at the end of the day feeling kind of motivationally empty, or at least motivationally dissatisfied. And I say, I just didn't do anything during class today that felt satisfying or enjoyable. So the idea is engagement is a spark to motivational satisfaction. So I'll put this all together. What does it mean? Kind of working towards a take-home message. This is the model of engagement we're working with at present. So this is the basic social context on the left, motivation, engagement, outcomes on the right. Again, Ellen Skinner's model that we're very fond of. But where's engagement fit in there? First, you can see that the first function, I've got our data are telling us that behavioral engagement, meaning effort and persistence and on task, and agentic engagement, initiative and contributing constructively into your own learning, are moderately good predictors of making progress, of learning or achieving in the class. But not necessarily emotional engagement and cognitive engagement. Again, this is the data telling us this, as well as some theory. So the way we think about this is enthusiasm and learning strategies are preparation for action rather than action themselves. They feed into the other indicators of engagement, but they're not engagement per se. Engagement is action, and that's behavior and agency. And we think these are the predictors of actually making progress. And you can see that emotional engagement actually predicts cognitive engagement. That's Reinhard Peckram's studies. And then NEED-SAT motivation predicts all aspects of engagement. But the first function there is qualified, that effort and initiative predict growth and achievement. The second stop sign is that behavioral engagement and agentic engagement are good predictors of motivational satisfaction, goal attainment, competence satisfaction, etc. And the third one is agentic engagement is a particularly good predictor of a more motivational supportive learning environment for yourself, meaning usually more autonomy, support, and less control, maybe more structure and less chaos, etc. So the take-home message, I've got three that I'd like to toss out for you to think about. And the first one is engagement does explain achievement, although it's a moderate predictive. And it's also a qualified relationship that is probably limited to behavioral and agentic engagement. Second conclusion would be that engagement requires a lot of support. Relationship support, teacher support, peer support, parent support, autonomy support, and support from yourself, from your own motivation. Where does engagement come from? It comes from your own motivation. And the more you're able to feed and grow your motivation, the more you feed and grow your engagement. Pretty strong relationship there. But you need a lot of motivational and relationship support to stay engaged or to become more engaged than before. And the third is a practical kind of take-home message that if you're planning on an intervention to increase students' engagement, I ask you to think twice about that. Is that really the best strategy to make a difference in the classroom? What we find a much more constructive intervention strategy is to work on the supports to engagement. And that is to increase autonomy, supportive teaching, and to increase students' motivational satisfaction. Everything from need satisfaction to self-efficacy to value, etc. So if you're really interested in growing engagement or growing learning and achievement, we recommend you go back to the left of this earlier diagram and offer students autonomy, supportive learning environments and relationships, and create opportunities for motivational satisfaction. Hope that makes sense. Take-home message, the three functions or purposes of engagement: grow achievement or academic progress, create motivationally satisfying learning environments for yourself, and create opportunities for motivational satisfaction. Okay, thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Kent McIntosh, and I'm a professor at the University of Oregon. I'm very excited to speak with you today about engaging students through co-creating behavior support systems in schools. So I'm going to spend our time talking about the importance of student voice in systems, and then how we can incorporate student voice and build systems together in terms of 5 core areas for implementation of behavior support systems. First, I want to share a little bit of information about the framework that we use at the Center on PBIS, or Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports. One of the things that we see is that it is important that we focus on outcomes, and we use data and practices, but we also think about embedding those within systems to increase equity throughout. So this PBIS, or Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports approach, is not just used in the US, but actually in over 35 countries around the world. And one of the reasons for that is because it has been shown in multiple rigorous studies to lead to improved valued outcomes, reductions in negative outcomes, and improvements in positive outcomes, both for students and for adults. But what I want to describe right now is how we can take that and really think about partnering with students in the work. So I'm going to share with you this picture called the social discipline window. And what you can see is there are these quadrants of how we work with students in particular in terms of level of control from low to high, and in terms of support that we provide from low to high. So if you look in the top left corner, it is high control but low support, and that is punitive, and that is doing our systems to students. Where we really would like to be is high control and high support in that collaborative top right corner called with. So I'm going to describe how to move into that with area through these core practices of tier 1, meaning universal for all students in the school, PBIS. So number 1, defining school-wide expectations. Number 2, teaching and practicing those. Number 3, systems for acknowledging pro-social behavior. And then some others that we may not get to are responding instructionally to unwanted behaviors instead of excluding or punishing students' behavior. And then also using data for decision-making. Most of the resources I'm going to share with you come from this PBIS Cultural Responsiveness Field Guide that you can get on our PBIS website, pbis.org. And I'm going to talk you through a few examples here and give you some strategies that you can use specifically in schools that have been shown to improve student outcomes. Now, first, thinking about those core practices, the first one of define. One of the things that we know is that there are some critical features of how we define how we want students to act or behave or interact with each other in schools. And one of the things that we know is that setting up school-wide expectations so that we are clear and explicit about what we want is really, really important and foundational. Some of the things that we know when we set these up, they are more effective when there are a small number of them, so that anything that you would expect can be linked under one of these, that they're memorable so that students and adults remember them and can use them regularly, that they're broad so they would cover anything that we would expect each other to do or act. They're positively stated. They say what to do instead of what not to do. And they are culturally relevant. They are actually connected to values that students have from their homes and in their communities. So I'll share with you one example here. This is from a local K-8 school, so elementary and middle school. And what you can see here is they have 3 school-wide expectations, and you can see they're actually printed and displayed around the building in the 2 most common native languages spoken in that school community, those school communities. We've got we are safe, we are respectful, and we do our personal best. Now, one of the things that's really important is you see that word we on there. Many schools implementing PBIS are starting this move from be, which really feels like we're commanding a student to do something, to really be thinking about we and inviting students into a learning community where the expectations we have also apply to the adults. And so when we look at that social discipline window, when we say be, that's really in this 2 part of the window, but we want to think about we are. And so that's one way that we can do it without being more pointing fingers at students. Instead, we think about joining our community, and this is how we all work together. All right. So once we've defined those, it's critically important that we teach and practice those. And so in PBIS and schools implementing PBIS, there are plans for teaching those both at the beginning of the year and at key times throughout the year. What we want to do is make sure to teach those expectations in the setting. So that means when we're talking about being in the cafeteria and our expectations there, we actually teach that lesson in the cafeteria as opposed to somewhere else, like in the classrooms or in an assembly area. We want to teach what the words are, so and use those expectations regularly. We want to explain a little bit of why, and we want to teach what does it look like and what does it not look like, and help students understand the difference. So when we think about increasing student voice in this area, we want to think about actually students teaching those expectations to each other. So the older students in the school leading those lessons as opposed to the adults in the building. I'm going to share with you one more strategy to increase a little bit of voice, and this is really more of a family voice. This is a strategy that we call positive family sayings, and it comes from Zaretta Hammond and some of her work that she has done. But what we want to think about doing is using a lesson where we ask students, what are some of the sayings from home that your family members or those around you who are raising you, your caregivers, use to guide your positive behavior? And that's really going to vary based on culture and based on family. But maybe you'll see some of these here, like treat others as you would like to be treated, or be kind, or never stop trying, or whatever those are. What you would do in this case is you'd ask students, and I've got a resource that I can that you can click on in a moment, to ask students, what are those positive family sayings? And there's even some letters that you can send home to families so that they can talk about it together. And then have students actually design posters, and you can actually put them up around the classroom, and then the teacher can reference, students can reference those and say, hey, remember, you like to say treat others as you would like to be treated. So what would that look like right now? And so it's a great way to use that voice of family and feel like that's connected to school. So here's a resource for that. In addition, once we've defined and teach some practice, it's really important for us to acknowledge and use positive reinforcement for that behavior that we want to see. And when we think about that, we want to think about everybody in the building acknowledging, being on the lookout for the behaviors that we want to see, and pointing it out, providing descriptive feedback, maybe using some kind of acknowledgement system, like a formal reward system. But what we really want to go for is this 5-to-1 positive to corrective or positive to negative ratio. Now, one of the things that I think is really important is that there are ways that we can acknowledge behavior that are very effective for individuals and that students really like and enjoy. And there are some where the type of praise might actually be uncomfortable for students, and they might not like that way. And it might be down to, there may be cultural differences or family differences, but it might also be down to individuals. And so a strategy that we like to use is called the praise preference assessment. And you can see a link on here. And this is a survey or an interview where you can identify for individual students what are the kinds of ways that they would like or not like to be acknowledged when they're following expectations and when they're doing the right thing. So here's an example of one here. Most of the time, this is done via survey. So students will write their names on and actually rate it, but you could do an individual interview or something for students as well. But here are the steps. So number one, you have to create a form, and I'll describe that. Ask students to rate the options, and then review the results to improve the quality of our interactions with students. So let me walk through each one of these. So when we create the assessment form, what we want to do is obviously be able to put the student's name, because we want to be able to connect their answers to them and how we interact with them. But then we want to put a list of what are the possible things that we are willing to do to acknowledge positive behavior from students. One thing that's really critical is not to put anything on the list that teachers are not willing to do. And so each classroom might have a different form. And we have some examples where you can, editable examples, so you can come and look and identify what are the things I want to include and add, and there are a few different versions and different developmental levels. Once you've created that form, you have students go through and they might rate them from 1 to 5. One of the things that we really like is this idea of circle the things that you like and also cross out the ones that you do not like, because it's important for us to see what students would find reinforcing, but also ones that would make a student uncomfortable or would be sort of punishing to them. So once you take that, you actually collect those from students, and you do this in 2 ways. One of them is you could look, and if there's a student with whom you're having some difficulty connecting with, then what you would want to do is make sure that when you acknowledge students, you do it in a way that they like and not in a way that they don't like. But another thing you can do is you can look at the class-wide responses and see maybe the students don't like your classroom acknowledgement system. And so that would be a way to be able to tweak that to make it work, not just for individual students, but for all students as well. And you might be thinking, gosh, how do I keep all of that in mind for all of my students all at the same time? And the good news is you don't necessarily need to do that, but looking at it in general and then identifying a few students with whom you haven't built really positive connections with can be very, very valuable. And so in that sense, it can be used for individual students and also the whole class. So if you're looking for some resources related to that, you can click on this link right here and you can find those resources there available to you. All right. I'm going to share one more resource with you, and just note that each of these has some evidence base behind it, so you can feel comfortable and confident about that. And you can find that in the Cultural Responsiveness Field Guide. But I'm going to share one more way of getting student voice into your systems, and it is related to using data for decision making. So we at the Center on PBIS have just released a new survey for students, and it is not exactly a school climate survey, but rather a way to get a meaningful feedback from students about how they're connecting with the behavior support system. So there's sections on how we define positive behavior, and there are sections on how we teach, how we acknowledge, how we respond to unwanted behavior. And so it's a combination of yes, no answers, and then also open-ended, so students can type in their answers. And for us in the US, you can take that online in English, and you can, we have it in English and Spanish, but you're welcome to download the manual, and you can see the link right there on the screen, and adapt it and tweak it to work better for the needs that you have. So that was 5 core practices of PBIS, and also 5 ways to make it more of a co-creation with students, as opposed to a top-down adult directing students to do it. And what I think you'll be able to find is when you do that work in this area, you will find that students are more engaged in the work, fewer instances of unwanted behavior, more positive behavior, and improved student outcomes in terms of engagement, attendance, desired behavior, less unwanted behavior, better academic outcomes, and graduation outcomes. So if you have any questions about what I have shared, you are welcome to contact me. You can contact me via email, or you can connect with me on Twitter as well. So thank you very much for your time here. I really appreciate it and hope that this information has been helpful for you in terms of improving student engagement by co-creating the systems with our students. All right, and thank you very much, and good luck in the work that you are doing, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference.
Hello, I'm Jennifer Greif-Green. I'm an associate professor at Boston University in the Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. Thank you so much for having me here today for the 2023 Global Human Engagement Conference. I'm going to be speaking about student engagement specifically in the context of school bullying and bullying prevention programs. And I just wanted to start by saying how grateful I am for the opportunity to be a part of your conference. I was really thrilled to hear about your focus on student engagement and school experiences. And even though I am here in Boston, I'm very happy to be able to join you virtually and to be a part of these discussions. The presentation today is based on a chapter that I co-authored in the Handbook of Student Engagement Interventions, and I wrote it with my colleagues Michael Furlong at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and Melissa Holt and Rachel Oblath at Boston University. I put a link to our website here. Melissa Holt and I co-lead a research lab called the BU Social Adjustment and Bullying Prevention Lab, and that's our lab's web address. Research on student engagement has often focused on the role of teachers and school staff and other adults in fostering engagement, but in this presentation we'll specifically be talking about how relationships with peers are associated with student engagement, and especially again in the instance of negative peer relationships, including bullying. In the talk today, I'll start by talking about the link between school bullying and student engagement, and also the link between student engagement and school bullying. Second, I'm going to talk a little bit about bullying prevention programs themselves and how to make those bullying prevention programs engaging for students. And then I have a few recommendations for research and practice. So to start by talking a little bit about bullying and cyberbullying, bullying and cyberbullying are really top concerns among students and parents worldwide. A number of surveys worldwide have indicated that up to about 30% of students experience bullying victimization in any given year, although there is some evidence that bullying declined during the COVID-19 pandemic. But in general, over the last couple of decades, there has been a rapid increase in attention to bullying and bullying prevention efforts, both in the news and in schools. For example, in the United States, in the past 2 decades, all 50 states have enacted legislation to address bullying, and bullying prevention programs are used widely internationally, including, from what I understand, in South Korea. To give a brief definition, bullying is a subtype of peer aggression, and it's defined by its intentionality, so it's done on purpose. It's repetition, so it's not a one-time event, it's something that happens over and over again, and it involves an imbalance of power between the student who's doing the bullying or the target and the student, the aggressor and the student who's being bullied, the target. Bullying can be physical, so it can include hitting or pushing or other physical acts of aggression. It can be verbal, so for example, teasing or threatening. It can be relational and include exclusion and rumor spreading. And it can also be electronic, as in the case of cyberbullying. Bullying can occur through texting or social media, emails, or other online activities. Often students who experience one form of bullying also report that they experience other forms of bullying as well. In terms of the conceptual connection between bullying and student engagement, experiences with bullying can really undermine the foundation of school communities and leave students feeling detached
from their peers and from adults around them. And they feel detached from their peers who are aggressing against them, but also peers who observe that happening and don't intervene. And similarly, bullying can lead students to feel disconnected from teachers and other adults at their school because those adults might be unaware of bullying, or they might be aware of it and unable to make it stop happening. So students involved in bullying may end up questioning the purpose and the value of school, and that can lead to school absences or even school attrition. And as a result, it's the experiences of student disengagement from school that result from bullying that can often continue long after bullying itself has stopped. Although, as you've heard in this conference, there are many definitions of student engagement, for the purposes of this presentation, I'll be using the framework proposed by Jennifer Fredericks and colleagues, which proposes 3 different forms of student engagement: behavioral, affective, and cognitive. Behavioral engagement typically refers to actions that students engage in, such as attending school, adhering to classroom norms, participating in classroom activities, and completing assignments. Other behaviors such as school avoidance or not bringing materials to school could be examples of behavioral disengagement. Affective engagement refers to students' attitudes and feelings towards school, as well as their responses, emotional responses to things that are happening in school. And finally, cognitive engagement refers to students' mental efforts and exertion during learning tasks. Research provides robust evidence that bullying involvement in multiple forms is associated with decreases in student behavioral and affective and cognitive engagement in school. In terms of cognitive engagement, as one example, one study found that elementary school students who were the targets of peer victimization had more difficulty with aspects of cognitive engagement, such as task completion and attention regulation, than their peers. Another study with adolescents in Chile found that aggressors of bullying, so the students who were involved in bullying as the bullies, reported greater cognitive disengagement from school. In terms of affective engagement, as an example, a study by Lee and colleagues found that students involved in bullying in 3 roles: as aggressors, or students who were doing the bullying, as targets, or students who were being bullied, and bully victims, who are students who are both involved as aggressors and involved as targets, reported lower affective engagement in school. So they said that they cared less about school, and they also felt less cared for by school than their peers who were uninvolved in bullying. And in that study, they found that the affective disengagement was greatest for students who were chronic targets of victimization. So students who were targets for a very long period of time were most likely to be disengaged. And finally, in terms of behavioral disengagement, an example is the longitudinal 4-H study of positive youth development conducted in the United States, which found that students who reported being aggressors in bullying had lower levels of behavioral engagement. They were more likely to arrive at school without their homework completed or without required materials than their peers who were not involved in bullying. These results have also been found at the school level. So a study by Maida and colleagues found that first-year high school students who perceived higher levels of bullying within their school generally reported much lower levels of commitment to school and participation in extracurricular activities. So it wasn't just about bullying happening to them individually or personally, but just perceiving that there was more bullying happening in their community led students to feel less connected to school. Now, it might seem obvious that there's a link between students who are targets of bullying and disengagement, so I just want to highlight that a number of these studies also found a link between being an aggressor or being a bully and less engagement with school. And that might be because being aggressive leads students to feel disconnected from their peers and disconnected from their teachers. And from a practical perspective, students who are aggressors might be more likely through disciplinary measures to be removed from their classroom or even removed from their school, which can lead them to have less time with their teachers and fewer interactions with their peers. There's also some evidence that these relationships are bidirectional. So it's not just that bullying is related to declines in student engagement, it also seems that student disengagement is associated with increased likelihood of being involved in bullying. So for example, students who are not engaged in pro-social activities or positive activities at school may be more likely to engage in bullying behaviors as a way to gain attention or to perhaps increase their social status. There's a study as an example by Forrester and colleagues that followed students, middle school students, over a 6-month period during the school year, and they found that students who had less affective engagement at the first time point were more likely to be involved in bullying perpetration and victimization 6 months later. Okay, so if we think about the relationship between school bullying and student engagement, it therefore seems likely or possible that bullying prevention programs can have the effect of increasing student engagement, not just decreasing bullying. Most studies of bullying prevention programs have, of course, attempted to quantify their impact by studying their effects on reductions in bullying behaviors at school. And these evaluations have generally found the strongest effects for programs that are comprehensive in their scope. So programs that aren't just a one-time presentation, but involve multiple sessions and integrate community and family partners tend to be more effective than one-off programs. And most effective programs are also those that focus on changing the behaviors of bystanders, which are the students who witness bullying but are not directly involved as targets or as aggressors. But there's reason to think that bullying prevention programs may also indirectly increase student engagement, although relatively few studies have focused on that question. But students who are targets of bullying are not just actively victimized. Rather, many of them are systematically and purposefully rejected from their peer social structures. So even if prevention programs address overt forms of bullying, like physical bullying, which is often what they focus on, if students are chronically excluded and made to feel disconnected from school, then reducing bullying itself might be ineffective. So it's important for school staff engaged in bullying prevention programs to consider questions about how to create conditions that actively accept students who have been targeted and how to foster feelings of connectedness among students who peers have rejected, sometimes over a long period of time. Bullying prevention programs that focus on bystanders, for example, can teach that standing up for students who are targets of bullying might not only stop the bullying, although hopefully it does that, but it might also fundamentally shift or reshape peer relationships in school. And those changes in the social ecology at school can have important implications for students to feel accepted and engaged in their peer and school contexts. So I'm going to talk a little more in this next section about those bullying prevention activities. And if one of our goals is to use bullying prevention programs to increase student engagement, then it's important to think about how they can be implemented effectively and in ways that are engaging for students, because when students are engaged in those programs and activities, they're more likely to make the changes that we're hoping for in the school community. Unfortunately, a number of studies, as I'll talk about in the next slide, have found that many students do not find bullying prevention activities to be particularly engaging. So imagine that you're a student who has experienced bullying at school and you go to a school presentation about bullying only to find that your peers seem bored or are disruptive or making fun of the presentation. The impact on students can be that they feel even more distanced and disengaged from school. There is some evidence that teachers perceive that students are engaged in bullying prevention programs and that their engagement in these programs is high, but there's reason to suspect that students are often not as engaged in prevention activities. In particular, some studies by Cunningham and colleagues involve focus groups with students where students were asked about their experiences with bullying prevention efforts. In these focus groups, students said that they found some of the most common strategies used to implement bullying prevention programs, like assemblies, presentations, and posters, to be boring. They said that messages were frequently repeated to the point that they became ineffective. So for example, posters were sometimes placed around the school with the same message posted throughout the school and sometimes the same posters over several years. Negatively worded messages like "don't bully" were off-putting to students, and students said that speakers who came in from the outside sometimes had limited credibility because they didn't have a relationship with those presenters. Further, some students described bullying prevention efforts to be negatively impacted by peers who were disengaged or disruptive. And this isn't true for all programs, but some students expressed that they were concerned that bullying in their school worsened following prevention efforts where students didn't feel very engaged. One explanation for these negative reactions is the concept of psychological reactance theory. This is the idea that the experiences of message recipients, who in this case are the students exposed to bullying prevention messages, is that students may feel threatened by those messages and therefore reinstate their sense of freedom by adopting the opposite position or denigrating the source of information. And these findings raise some questions that are important to think about when we're thinking about the effective implementation of bullying prevention programs. Schools that are mindful of curricular sequences may have programs that are less redundant, and so it's important to think about how programs and schools can be implemented in ways that continue to be engaging over long periods of time. And this might be linked to some research that has found that the effectiveness of bullying prevention programs tends to be higher for younger students than for students once they reach adolescence. One reason for this might be that some studies have found that adolescents find the term bullying itself to not be a relevant term. And adolescents have sometimes said that they are more eager to engage in conversations about other emerging forms of victimization, such as dating and sexual violence. I wanted to highlight that a number of organizations have been working to develop innovative strategies for enhancing engagement and bullying prevention. And these include using children's media, and I have some examples on this slide, comic books, and even interviews with sports stars and materials from entertainers and performers. So in the top box there, you can see it says Boston versus Bullies. This is a bullying prevention program here in Boston that my research team helped to evaluate that included interviews with celebrity athletes and stars in the Boston area who talked about bullying and bullying prevention methods. And in that bottom box where it says Toward Kindness, that's from Lady Gaga's Born This Way Foundation, and she's using herself as an entertainer to put forward messages about bullying prevention. So from this research, I have a number of recommendations that I wanted to share. First, for researchers, I think it's important for research to include measures of student engagement in evaluations of bullying prevention programs. As I mentioned before, it's really not enough to just measure if bullying prevention programs decrease bullying itself, but also it's important to consider the impact of bullying prevention programs on the broader community of students within a school. Second, a recommendation is to adopt strategies from other fields to increase the effectiveness of anti-bullying messaging. So for example, drawing on the fields of marketing and communication to be thinking about how we're wording messages and how we're talking about messages related to bullying for students. And three is to evaluate innovative initiatives. And there's a lot of evaluation work being done around established initiatives, but as different partners, entertainers, communities, and even students themselves are developing innovative approaches to reducing bullying, it's important to think about how we can evaluate if those are working and for whom those are working best. And then I also have some recommendations for practitioners. First, to select bystander intervention programs as the bullying intervention program. And this is because studies have shown that bystander intervention programs tend to be the most effective programs at reducing bullying, and also because programs that are only focused on targets of bullying or aggressors in bullying will miss the majority of students in the school and be less engaging for students. So most students are bystanders, but only a smaller percentage of students are actively involved as targets or as aggressors. So bystander intervention programs will be more relevant and more engaging for a broader number of students. Second is to integrate bullying prevention programs with broader social and emotional programs. We know that bullying is connected to other victimization experiences and the social and emotional well-being of students, and programs will be most effective when they connect those pieces of material for students and when they broadly address the engagement and exclusion and connection and friendship experiences of students. Number three is to actively engage students in prevention and promotion teams. Students have a lot to say about our bullying initiatives and about our bullying prevention activities, and their voices can help to shape what's happening in their own school community. Fourth is to consider the sequence of curricula and to reduce redundancy. So when we're teaching other subjects, like when we're teaching science or we're teaching math, one of the things we do is we think about what students have learned up to that point, and we even often assess what they've learned up to that point, and then we think about how our curriculum builds on their prior knowledge and can help to foster deeper learning and broader learning of the topic that we're covering. So the same thing really needs to happen with bullying prevention and social emotional learning activities, where we're shifting and changing over time in response to what students have already learned and going deeper and going broader into these topics. And finally, using developmentally appropriate structure and language. It's important to think about, if adolescents are saying that the word bullying doesn't apply to them, how we're instead going to approach these topics in ways that feels relevant and feels important and meaningful to them. Thank you so much for having me here today. I put my email address up on this slide. Please feel free to reach out to me with any questions about this presentation or this topic.
Hello, welcome at my presentation about work engagement. Today, I will talk about new scientific insights when it comes to this phenomenon of work engagement. My name is Arnold Bakker. I am located at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. Let's start with the definition of work engagement. Work engagement is a positive, fulfilling, and work-related state of mind that is characterized by 3 elements. And the elements are vigor, meaning that you are full with energy. The second element is dedication. Dedication is the attitudinal component of work engagement, meaning that you are full with enthusiasm about your work. And the third component is absorption. Absorption means that you are really immersed in the work activities. So you forget about time, you forget where you are, and you are really focused on your work. Work engagement, we have seen over the years that it has many important outcomes, including creativity. So engaged workers are more creative, they have more innovative ideas. Engaged workers are more inclined to help others, to support them, and to be pro-social. Engaged workers are also more inclined to follow safety rules. So that's another important outcome of engagement. They are less often absent, less long absent as well when they are sick. Their sales volume is higher than non-engaged employees, and their clients are more satisfied. So there are quite a few positive outcomes of work engagement, as shown in reviews of the literature. So then an important question is, where does engagement come from? So what are the drivers of work engagement? And we have looked at many different elements in the work environment. And one important category here to consider is job demands. So job demands are all the facets of work that cost effort and therefore cost energy. So you can think here about your workload, conflicts that you may have with a colleague or a client, the number of emails that's coming in your email, job insecurity that you may perceive, or social isolation that, for example, when you work often at home or alone. And also complex tasks is an example of job demands that cost energy. So job demands cost physical and mental effort, and therefore it is exhausting, it's tiring. On the other hand, we have job resources, and resources can be such things as social support from colleagues, task significance, so how important is the task that you are doing, autonomy, do you have any control over the tasks that you are performing, skill variety, can you use a variety of your skills, feedback about your performance, opportunities to develop yourself. So according to job demands resources theory, the job is composed of many different demands and resources, and these demands and resources can be different in different organizational contexts. But what is important here is the combination of the demands and the resources. So in any organization, you will find aspects of work that cost energy, and on the other hand, aspects of work like job resources that have motivating potential, that help you to learn, to give meaning and have impact. And together they determine your work experience. So what we see here is that when people have many job demands, so like a high workload, conflicts, complex work and so forth, that is going to be a problem over time when this is paired with low levels of job resources. So what we need here is to move in this direction, in the direction of work engagement, which can be achieved by increasing the job resources. So by providing the support and autonomy needed to deal with a high workload or to deal with the conflicts or the complex work. So here's the combination of high demands, high resources. We see here the combination of high resources, but not so many things to do, so low challenges. This is the situation of boredom, and here we need to go up, so we need to increase the demands. So we see here that job demands resources theory can explain work engagement by looking at combinations of job demands and resources. So it's important to have both at a high but affordable level. So organizations can provide job demands and resources, but what we have seen in the last 10 to 15 years is that what is also very important is how proactive employees are themselves. So proactivity is the self-starting and future-oriented behavior that brings about change in one's self or in the situation. So you see something and you want to change it. That can be something in your environment. So for example, certain tasks that you need to do, you can change the order of the tasks. Or you do not agree with something, you can raise your voice and say, oh, okay, I don't agree, I want to say something about this. This is proactive work behavior, according to Grant and Ashford and Friese and Fay. So this proactive behavior is very important, as we can see here, because the job resources, they help people to stay engaged. And when people are engaged in their work, we see that they are proactive, they show proactive behavior in order to stay engaged. Because through their proactive behavior, they can generate new resources, and these resources they can then use to deal with the demands and to stay engaged. So this is a kind of gain, a positive cycle that people go through from day to day. So on a daily basis, in order to be engaged, you need to be proactive. You need to take initiative to change the situation or yourself in order to generate job resources. So, and one example of this proactive behavior that we have studied a lot is job crafting. Job crafting refers to proactive changes individuals make in their job demands and their job resources. So for example, if you see that you have a high workload, you can try to lower your workload. Or if you need support from your colleagues, you can ask for support. And the reason to do so, to engage in job crafting, is to get a better fit between you as a person and the job, between your abilities and preferences on the one hand, and the job on the other hand. So you can increase your challenges. So for example, start a new project. You can increase resources, ask for feedback, for example, and you can reduce the demands that are very high, like complaining customers, you can try to avoid. We see here, and there are quite a few studies, like a few hundred of studies now that have been performed. This is a study that I was involved in, a study at a chemical plant where we followed employees over time. And we see here that when the employees engage in job crafting behaviors, they do increase over time their social job resources, like social support and performance feedback. They get more of that over time. They also increase their structural resources, like they get more autonomy, they negotiate that with their supervisor. And as a consequence of these increased resources, their well-being also increases over time, including increased work engagement, reduced burnout, and increased job satisfaction. We have seen also that job crafting can also be taught to employees. So we have developed interventions, and the design of such studies looks as follows. So we have an intervention group and a control group. We have a pre-test and an immediate post-test after the intervention, and then a later post-test, for example, 3 months later or 1 year later. We compare the intervention group with a control group that does not receive a training. And in the training, the employees learn about the background of the intervention. What is the idea here? What do we want to influence? They learn about job demands and resources. They make a top 3 of their most important demands that cost effort, and the most important resources, so that are motivating. And then they learn that they can influence their job demands and resources through job crafting. So job crafting, this proactive behavior, is then used to optimize the work environment. So in the training, the participants engage in exercises, and in the end, they make a personal crafting plan with weekly goals that they want to meet. So they set goals regarding their job crafting. So job crafting goals. So at the end of the training, they have this personal crafting plan, and in the weeks following the training, they implement their plan. So they try to reach their goals, the job crafting goals. So for example, in 1 week, they can decide to increase their challenges. And in the next week, they can try to increase their resources. And often in these projects, not always, but sometimes we use coaching. So we have coaches that help the employees to craft their jobs and to come up with good ways to do so. And then we look at the effects in our scientific research. So this is a study by Heather Gordon, Eva Demaruti, and others. I was also involved in this study, conducted in a hospital among nurses. We see here that the training intervention, so the intervention group is in orange, the job crafting behaviors increased over time in the intervention group, not in the control group. So the control group numbers are the same as before the intervention. We see that also the work engagement has increased in the intervention group, not in the control group. So this is an important effect. And we also analyzed that the effect of the intervention on engagement was through job crafting behavior. So people use what they learn in the training, which influences their work engagement. We see a slight drop in exhaustion. This was already low, but it's still significant. So the level of fatigue goes down. And we see quite a steep increase in their performance. So the nurses perform better, they take better care of their patients after the intervention, after they have learned to craft and optimize their job. This is another study that I conducted this year with professors all over the world. And what we see here, that is when professors are confronted with all types of job demands, including emotional demands, their engagement goes down, but this is less the case if they use optimizing demands. So a form of job crafting where they try to make their demands bearable. So job crafting buffers here the negative impact of emotional demands on work engagement. So the second proactive work behavior that can be used to increase your own work engagement is playful work design. And playfulness, it was the Dutch philosopher Huizinga who referred to play as having two components. One is ludic play, which comes from the Latin word ludus, which refers to the fun part of playing, the childish and the fantasy part of playfulness. And on the other side, we have agonistic play. So agonistic play is based on the Greek word agon, which refers to contest or competition. So two types of play: ludic play and competitive or agonistic play. Fun and competition. So why do people play at work? Well, they can try to get rid of boredom. They can try to experience flow, to really get into their work and to have a positive feeling. They can try to reduce stress by using humor and a playful approach of work, and also by framing work as play or as a game. It becomes already a more positive experience. This is an overview of Peteltsik and others. So we developed this concept of playful work design, which is then defined as a proactive and cognitive behavioral approach aimed at fostering fun and challenge during work activities. So playful work design is different from job crafting in that it is directed at the tasks, not necessarily at the job as a whole. So for example, it could be that a retail security guard tries to predict customer behavior. So where is he going, or which product is he going to buy, which is more interesting than just standing at the door and looking at the customers or looking around. So trying to predict customer behavior would be an example of playful work design. We all know the example of a barista making latte art, so nice figures on the top of your coffee. I often play a game with myself when I try to get rid of many emails, like, for example, get rid of 50 emails in 1 hour. It's very difficult, but if you get rid of 40 emails, you will be happy as well. So you can never lose. So the competition that you play is with yourself, not with others. So we see in our research that some people are more playful than others. So if you have a proactive personality, you're more likely to play. If you have humor by nature, you're more likely to use playfulness and to use playful work design. Curiosity is a predictor, competitiveness is a predictor, and also fantasy. If you have more fantasy, you're more likely to use playful work design. So we see in our research that on the days, this is a daily diary study where we ask people every day at the end of the day how much they designed their work to be more playful. So did you use today ways to design your work to be more fun, design your work to be more challenging and competitive? On these days, people reported higher levels of work engagement and also higher levels of creativity. So we see that daily playful work design is a direct predictor of work engagement. So people can use play to improve their own work engagement and creativity. We also see that some people are better at this than others. So openness as well as playfulness, the stable personality components, are moderators of these effects. So the effects that you see here, these positive effects, are stronger for people who are high in openness and high in playfulness. So we see that here, playful work design used on a daily basis is positively related to work engagement, particularly for individuals high in openness. And we found the same effect for playfulness. So people who are playful by nature, for them, playful work design works better in that it leads more to work engagement. So the implications of these findings is that in order to be engaged, people can try, or organizations can try, to optimize the job design. It's an optimal mix of demands and resources. We need to train leaders so that they know that they can optimize the job demands and resources, so that people can have affordable challenges, but going along with important resources that leaders can also give to their employees. We can use job crafting, so proactively change the job demands and resources ourselves. And we can use playful work design, so in a playful, fun, or challenging way, approaching your tasks in a different way. So in case you're interested, we just finished a new paper on this, Bakker, Demeruti, and Sans-Vergel, in the annual review of organizational psychology. So please go to my website to look for that paper. in case you're interested. I wish you a very nice rest of the conference, and I thank you for your attention.
Hello, I'm Alan Sachs from the University of Toronto, and I'm going to be talking to you today about the importance of caring for employee engagement. So the title of my presentation is a question, which I hope to answer. The question is, how important is care for employee engagement? Let me begin by reviewing a number of questions that are often asked when it comes to employee engagement. The first question is perhaps the most common question, and that is, how engaged are employees? And we know a great deal about the answer to this because many surveys have been done over the years, generally showing that, for the most part, employees across the globe are not very highly engaged. In fact, many reports show that only about a third of employees are highly engaged. The second question, also asked very often, and that is, what are the antecedents that predict employee engagement? And as I'll show you shortly, again, we know a good deal about the various antecedents that predict employee engagement. The third question, what are the consequences of employee engagement? And we also know that employee engagement predicts many employee outcomes as well as organizational outcomes, which I'll discuss a little more shortly. The final question, and the one that I'm most interested in talking about and answering, is why do employees choose to be engaged or not to be engaged? And this is really about the mechanism or the psychology behind the employee engagement process and trying to understand why do employees choose to be engaged or not to be engaged. So let me just say a few things about what employee engagement is so it's clear what we are talking about. And I like to refer to two definitions which have some similarities but are also a little different. The first definition comes from Kahn's seminal study in 1990, and he describes and defines engagement in this way. When engaged, people employ and express themselves physically, cognitively, and emotionally in the performance of a work role. And notice some key distinctions that he makes in this definition, that when employees are engaged, there is a part of it in which they are employing themselves and another related part in which they express themselves. And secondly, notice also that when a person is engaged, this means that all aspects of themselves are put into the performance of a role, that is their physical, cognitive, and emotional selves. The second definition comes from Schaffelli and colleagues, and it focuses specifically on work engagement. And it says that work engagement is a positive, fulfilling, work-related state of mind that is characterized by vigor, dedication, and absorption. So it's a little different, but notice that each definition has these three dimensions, and it has often been pointed out that in some respects they do overlap. So for example, when we think of Kahn's three dimensions of physical, cognitive, and emotional, they somewhat overlap with the dimensions of vigor, dedication, and absorption. But generally speaking, when we think of employee engagement, we are talking about a multidimensional motivational state. Now let's look at some different employee engagement models. This model basically shows us what we often see in research and what the focus of research has been. And that is, what are the things that predict employee engagement, the antecedents, and what are the outcomes or the consequences? So a very common model of employee engagement shows antecedents leading to employee engagement and employee engagement leading to various consequences. Now, another model of employee engagement that we don't see as often, but is just as important, and that is the model that links the antecedents to employee engagement. So we know much less about the mechanisms or the psychology that links the antecedents to employee engagement. And this is what I'm most interested in. The mechanisms are perhaps the black box in between the antecedents and employee engagement. Now, as I was saying earlier, we know quite a bit about the antecedents of employee engagement. So this question, what are the antecedents, has been answered quite effectively over the last decade or so. And we know that there are a lot of different job resources that have been found to predict employee engagement. For example, from this meta-analysis by Crawford, Lepin, and Rich, they found things like autonomy, feedback, and job variety, so job characteristics, as well as opportunities for development, rewards and recognition, support, and role fit, all to be important predictors or antecedents of employee engagement. And we also know a great deal about the consequences. So there's been a lot of research about the consequences of employee engagement. And this research shows us that employee engagement is related to various employee attitudes, such as job satisfaction, organizational commitment, as well as intentions to quit. Employees who are more engaged have lower intentions to quit. They also have higher organizational citizenship behavior, higher job performance, greater health and well-being. And we also have research that links employee engagement to organizational outcomes, such as organizational performance. So as you can see, we clearly know a great deal about the antecedents and consequences of employee engagement. Now let's look at some of the theories of employee engagement to get an idea of what they tell us about the psychological mechanisms involved in the employee engagement process. So we can begin with Kahn's theory of engagement, in which he identified 3 psychological conditions of engagement. And the basic idea in his qualitative research was that the experience of these 3 psychological conditions would influence the extent to which an employee chose to be engaged or disengaged. And the 3 psychological mechanisms are psychological meaningfulness, in which employees would feel value in what they're doing and that they're getting a return on their investment, so it means something to them. They feel relatively safe in being engaged in their work. They don't feel it's a threat to their self-esteem or their well-being. And they have the resources that allow them to be psychologically available to be engaged. So those are the 3 key psychological mechanisms that Kahn identified. Now, there's not a great deal of research testing these 3 psychological mechanisms. But one of the first empirical studies to test Kahn's theory was by May, Gilson, and Harder. And they tested various predictors of the 3 psychological conditions and the relationship to engagement. And they found support that the psychological conditions were positively related to engagement, and also some evidence that they mediated the relationship between different antecedents and engagement. Overall meaningfulness has been found to have the strongest effect on engagement. And this has been shown in other studies as well, that among Kahn's psychological conditions, the one that really seems to matter the most is meaningfulness. But overall, there have not been a lot of studies on Kahn's psychological conditions. So we really can't say very much about the extent to which the psychological conditions from Kahn's model really are important for engagement, other than really meaningfulness. Now, looking at the job demands resources theory, this is also one of the primary theories used to study employee engagement. It divides working conditions into job resources and job demands. And the idea behind this theory is that job resources are motivational. They activate motivational processes, both intrinsic and extrinsic, and this leads to higher levels of work engagement and positive outcomes. It also suggests that job demands can exhaust employees, both physically and mentally, exhausting their resources, and this often results in negative outcomes such as burnout and disengagement. And it's also noteworthy that the job demands resources model has also included personal resources such as self-efficacy, optimism, and resilience, which can also have a positive effect on work engagement. Now, when we look at this model, in general, the job demands resources theory looks like this. You've got job resources, typically positively linked to work engagement, and job demands linked to work engagement, usually negatively, although there's evidence for a distinction between challenge demands and hindrance demands, challenge demands being more positively related to work engagement and hindrance demands negatively. But the point is, you can see that the job demands resources theory has not provided much in the way of explaining what's in between the job resources and job demands and work engagement. So this takes us to that question that I'm most interested in, and that is, well, what are the psychological mechanisms of employee engagement? So why do certain job resources and various antecedents lead to employee engagement? So we know that some of the antecedents might be associated with Kahn's 3 psychological conditions, but again, not a lot of support for that. And it's possible that some of the job resources and the job demands resources theory satisfy basic psychological needs for autonomy, relatedness, and competence. But again, there's not a great deal of support for that. So what I'm suggesting now and what I'm asking is, what about caring? What about caring? Can this be something that's important for employee engagement? So let me say a few things now about what caring is, and in particular, organizational care. Organizational care is, first of all, an organizational level construct, and it reflects perceptions regarding the broad provision of care by the organization to all employees. So it captures beliefs about the extent to which the organization cares for employees. And this definition comes from a study by McAllister and Bigley. So when we talk about organizational care, we are talking about an organization that is focused on employees' needs, fulfilling employees' needs, promoting employees' best interests, and valuing employees' contributions. So organizations that care about their employees are responsive to the needs, interests, concerns, and well-being of organizational members. Now, what I want to do is just go back to the study I did on the antecedents and consequences of employee engagement in 2006. That's quite some time ago. But back then, in that paper, I made this statement. I said, when employees believe that their organization is concerned about them and cares about their well-being, they are likely to respond by attempting to fulfill their obligation to the organization by becoming more engaged. So in effect, what I said there was that there could be a link, that employees who believe that they are cared for by their organization will return that care by being more engaged. Now, since then, I've looked at this a little more closely, and what I want to do is just report a number of studies which provide some evidence that there may actually be a linkage between caring and employee engagement. So one of the first studies that looked at care in organizations was by no other than Kahn, who in 1990 did that seminal paper on employee engagement. Well, in 1993, he did another really important study on organizational care. And he studied caring in a social service agency. And what he found was that the organizational members who felt cared for were more willing and more able to provide caregiving to other organizational members and clients. In other words, those who received care were able to give care back. When care was withheld, they felt frustrated, they felt angry, they felt that they could not be physically and emotionally involved in their work. So they withdrew physically and emotionally, and they eventually stopped providing care to their coworkers and their clients. So in effect, what Kahn showed was that a lack of caregiving was a contributing factor to burnout, disengagement, and turnover. So really what this is saying is that those employees who did not feel cared for were not able or were not willing to care for others and were not engaged in their work. They were disengaged and burnt out. Now, here's just a couple other findings from some other studies. So in this study, which I did with Cooper Thomas and Xu, what we were interested in was what kind of resources would be related to employee engagement. And using resource theory, we found that love resources are the strongest predictors of employee engagement. And this makes sense because employee engagement, being engaged itself, is a love resource because it represents warmth and caring. And when employees are engaged, they invest their wholehearted, full selves in the performance of a role. So the idea then behind resource theory is that people will exchange a similar resource for a resource that they've received. And what we found, in fact, was that when employees receive what are considered to be love resources, they would be more engaged because they are returning those love resources with engagement. So employees exchange their engagement for resources that demonstrate warmth and caring from the organization. Now here's another more recent study that was done on organizational care and employee engagement. They actually looked at what they called a psychological climate for caring. This is a climate that focuses on employees' perceptions of management care about the workforce and management priorities regarding trust, respect, fairness, a caring atmosphere, and safety in the workplace. And what they found was that a psychological climate for caring was positively related to self-reported productivity, work quality, and work engagement. So once again, we see a link between caring, in this case, a caring climate, and engagement. Now, here's a little something I looked at to try to get a little better idea of what's going on here. I went back to my study on the antecedents and consequences of employee engagement, and I wanted to look at the items in the perceived organizational support scale and the perceived supervisor support scale, because a component of support is caring. And some of the items in these scales include caring. And I wanted to find out what items in the scale are most strongly related to engagement. And I found that these caring items stood out as the strongest predictors of engagement. So there's an item here from the perceived organizational support scale. My organization cares about my opinions. And a similar item from the perceived supervisor support scale. My supervisor cares about my opinions. These items, which include caring, were the most strongly related to job engagement and organization engagement among the items used to measure POS and PSS. So again, providing some evidence of the importance of care for employee engagement. So this is essentially then what I'm suggesting. We look at a caring employee engagement model, that organizational care is this key mediating or linking mechanism that links various antecedents and job resources to employee engagement. So antecedents lead to organizational care, and that care then translates into higher levels of employee engagement. And if I draw this out in a little more detail in terms of, well, what are these various antecedents? What I'm showing here is that there are different sources of caring throughout an organization that contribute to caring, or what I call an organizational climate of care and concern for employees. So when you've got leadership that is caring for employees and makes decisions considering the best interests and the well-being of employees, when you have human resource management practices that are caring type practices, such as having flexible work arrangements, providing guidance in terms of career development and career planning, that these types of human resource practices, which I call caring human resource practices, will also contribute to caring. And when you have a manager who exhibits caring behaviors when he or she interacts with employees that will also contribute to caring. And that in combination, these different sources will lead to the development of an organizational climate of care and concern for employees. And it is within this climate that employees will return that care with higher levels of employee engagement. So then, to sum up what I'm saying with respect to this caring employee engagement model, I'm suggesting that employees will be more highly engaged in their job and organization when they believe that their organization, their management, their supervisors, and their coworkers care about them. And when there is this strong organizational climate which results from caring from these sources, you will have this strong organizational climate of care and concern for employees. And in accordance with social exchange theory, when employees believe that their organization cares about them, they will return that care by being more highly engaged. So in other words, employees will care more about their organization when they feel cared for, and they will demonstrate that care with higher levels of engagement. So to conclude then, employee engagement programs should therefore focus on caring for employees, because when employees feel they are cared for by the organization, they will care more about the organization and they will be more engaged. In terms of research, a key question to ask is, what antecedents are most likely to demonstrate care and concern towards employees? So there's a need to understand different antecedents, not only because of their relationship to engagement, but also to identify the extent to which they result in caring perceptions. And in terms of practice, a key question to ask is, what resources demonstrate that the organization cares about employees? So what resources should organizations be providing their employees because they demonstrate that the organization really cares about their employees? So organizations should implement programs and practices that offer resources to employees that provide caring towards employees in terms of their needs and their well-being if they want to have high levels of employee engagement. If they want to improve employee engagement, they need to show caring towards their employees, and they should offer programs and practices that clearly provide and demonstrate that care. So that concludes my presentation, in which I am suggesting that a key psychological mechanism that links various antecedents and job resources to employee engagement is caring and organizational caring. Thank you.
네, 안녕하십니까. 중앙대학교 송해덕 교수입니다. 제가 지금부터 말씀드리고자 하는 주제는요, 한국형 직업 몰입의 새로운 지평을 찾아서라고 말씀을 좀 드릴 수 있을 것 같습니다. 시작을 하면서요, 이 연구는 중앙대학교의 공동연구진들과 함께 이루어졌다는 것 먼저 말씀드리고자 합니다. 중앙대학교 휴먼 인게이지먼트 연구소에 함께 공동연구원으로 참여를 하고 계시는 교육학과의 홍화정 교수님, 또 조윤성 박사님과 함께 연구가 이루어졌습니다. 네. 중앙대 휴먼 인게이지먼트 연구소는요, 한국연구재단 사회과학 지원 사업에 지원을 받고 있습니다. 먼저 시작을 하면서 저희 연구소의 이름에서 느끼셨을 수 있겠지만서도요, 저희 연구소는 한국형 인게이지먼트에 주목을 하고 있습니다. 먼저 왜 인게이지먼트인가, 그리고 또 왜 한국형 인게이지먼트인가에 대해서 많이들 궁금해 하실 것으로 알고 있습니다. 사실 이 직업 몰입이라는 개념은요, 최근에 굉장히 많은 화두가 되고 있고 많은 연구가 이루어지고 있습니다. 그 이유 중에 하나는요, 바로 이 직업 몰입이 직원들로 하여금, 조직에 있는 구성원들로 하여금 긍정적인 태도를 갖게 하고, 조직에 대한 강한 신뢰를 바탕으로 해서 조직에 대해서 함께 함께하는 이런 헌신할 수 있는 동력을 제공을 해줌으로써 초과 성과 달성, 그리고 더 탁월한 성과를 창출하는데 커다란 공헌을 해줄 수 있다라고 이야기를 하고 있습니다. 직원 몰입 효과에 대한 여러 실증 연구하고 현장 조사 결과는 이를 제대로 뒷받침하고 있다라고 말씀을 드릴 수 있겠는데요. 그런데요, 과연 이렇게 직원 몰입이 중요하다라고 하면서도요, 우리나라에 있어서의 이 직원 몰입의 수준을 한번 들여다보면은요, 전 세계적인 이런 평균의 21%의 절반 수준인 12%에 불과하다라는 것들을 보실 수가 있습니다. 재미있는 것은요, 매일 경험하는 우울과 근심은 세계 최고의 수준인 약 36%에 이르고 있다고 말씀을 드릴 수 있습니다. 우리나라의 조직 구성원들의 몰입 정도, 조직에 대한 몰입과 헌신 정도는요, 전 세계 몰입 평균이 7.0인데에 비해서 6.5로 상대적으로 낮고요. 이 몰입과 같이 이야기되고 있는 활력이라든지 동기, 그 다음에 헌신, 직무 만족도에 대한 점수도 낮은 편이다라고 보고가 되고 있습니다. 이러할 경우에 있어서요, 많은 분들이 고심하는 것이 결국은 이 구성원들이 긍정적인 정서를 갖지 못함으로 인해서 부정적인 정서가 확산이 되고 또 이 조직 차원에서는요, 이 성과에도 상당히 많은 영향을 미치고 있다라는 겁니다. 특히 재미있는 것은요, 이 몰입이라고 얘기하는 것이 인게이지먼트라고 하는 것이요, 상당히 문화적이고 그 다음에 이런 상황적인 이런 특수성을 많이 반영하고 있다라는 겁니다. 네. 그런 측면에서 놓고 봤었을 때 우리나라에서의 이 몰입을 정확하게 진단하고 그 다음에 이를 진작시켜 줄 수 있는 방안을 찾는 게 굉장히 중요하다라고 저희 연구진에서는 공통적으로 생각을 했었습니다. 자, 그래서 저희들이 크게 한 3가지 정도의 질문을 갖고 지난 약 한 5년간 계속적으로 연구를 해왔습니다. 첫 번째는요, 과연 한국에서의 이 직원 몰입은 이 기존의 여러 다른 문헌에서 말하는 직원 몰입과 어떠한 다른 특성을 가지고 있는가라는 점이죠. 이를 답하기 위해서요, 저희들은 이 한국형 직원 몰입을 측정할 수 있는 척도를 탐색하고 개발해 왔습니다. 이미 저희가 여러 번 연구를 통해서 말씀을 드렸고요. 오늘 발표에서는요, 이러한 척도를 활용한 이 패널 조사의 설문 결과에 대해서 말씀을 드리고자 합니다. 그 이전에요, 과연 이 한국형 직원 몰입의 척도는 어떻게 구성되는가를 한번 잠깐 상기할 필요가 있습니다. 저희들이 조사한 바에 의하면요, 한국형 직원 몰입은요, 이 개인 차원의 몰입 그리고 이 조직 차원의 몰입을 2가지 차원을 동시에 가지고 있지만 특히 이 한국적인 상황에서 이 성과, 이 퍼포먼스에 대한 강조가 굉장히 많이 이루어지고 있다는 겁니다. 또 다른 한 가지 측면은요, 이 관계성입니다. 흔히들 저희가 이제 우리성이라는 말로 많이들 대표를 하고 있는데요. 이 우리성이라고 얘기하면 우리가 남이가 이런 얘기도 하고 그러는데요. 이 관계적인 측면에서도 몰입을 디파인할 수 있다라는 겁니다. 저희가 그래서 이 개발한 2가지 측정 도구가 있습니다. 첫 번째는 바로 이 성과 중심 직원 몰입이고요. 지금 보시는 것처럼요, 크게 보시는 것처럼 4가지 요인들로 이루어지고 있는 점들 보실 수가 있습니다. 조직 차원에서의 몰입, 그 다음에 정서적인 차원에서의 몰입, 개인적인 측면에서는요, 그리고 또 인지적인 차원에서의 몰입을 들 수 있는데, 여기서 흥미있는 점은 바로 성과 차원에서의 성과 추구 몰입이다라는 겁니다. 나에게 주어진 직무가 어렵더라도 어떻게든 완수를 한다. 직무 수행에 있어서 나에게 주어진 것 이상을 하려고 노력한다. 그리고 직무 성과를 향상시키기 위해서 다양한 시도를 한다. 라고 하는 것은요, 우리 한국인들 고유의 이런 어떤 성과 지향적인 것들을 잘 보여주는 문항들이라고 볼 수 있습니다. 또 다른 측정 도구입니다. 또 다른 측정 도구를 저희들이 개발한 것은 바로 이런 관계 중심 직원 몰입 측정 도구를 개발을 했었는데요. 결국은 몰입한다라고 하는 것은요, 이 개인적인 차원에서 인지적이고 정서적이고 또 이 행동적인 차원에서 이 적극적인 참여가 기본이 되는 것이기도 하고요. 이 조직 차원에서는요, 다른 사람들과의 관계를 어떻게 인지하고 있는가. 즉 나하고 상사 및 동료는 조직의 목표 달성에 집중하기 위해서 서로 돕는 방법을 알고 있고 조직 목표와 비전을 공유하고 있다라는 이런 것들이 되겠죠. 그다음에 관계적인 정서 차원에서는요. 나와 상사 및 동료는 서로를 아끼고 좋아한다라는 이런 것들이고요. 관계 행동은요. 좋은 관계를 유지할 수 있도록 서로 돕는다라는 겁니다. 지금 말씀하신 이런 두 가지 진단 도구를 저희들이 측정 도구를 개발을 하고 타당화하고 그다음에 해외 학술지에도 이미 게재를 한 바가 있습니다. 자, 그렇다면 저희들이 궁금한 것은 과연 한국에 있어서의 직원 몰입의 상태는 어떤가라는 점입니다. 네, 이런 측면에서 저희들은 한국형 직원 몰입의 종단적인 추적 조사를 위한 인적 자원 몰입 패널을 구축을 했습니다. 대한민국 11개 산업별, 조직 규모별로 총 210개 기업에서 1,713명의 근로자를 대상으로 대규모 조사를 진행을 했는데요. 특히 이 HRD 담당자를 따로 구별을 하고요. 일반 근로자들에 대한 설문을 중심으로 해서 패널을 구축을 한 바가 있습니다. 지금 보시는 것처럼요. 인적자원 몰입 패널의 응답 분포표인데요. 11개 산업군에 따라서요. 그 다음에 이 회사의 규모에 따라서 100인에서 300인 이하, 그 다음에 300인 이상에서 1000인 이하, 1000인 미만이죠. 그 다음에 1000인 이상의 기업들을 대상으로 해서요. 총 사업체 수가 210개, 그 다음에 일반 근로자 응답자 수가 1503명에 달한다라고 이렇게 패널을 구축을 했습니다. 그리고요, 이 패널에서 저희들이 물어본 것은 바로 여기 살펴보시는 것처럼요. 중앙대학교 휴먼 인게이지먼트 연구소의 몰입 모델에 근거를 해서요. 이 몰입이 바로 가운데 있는 몰입이죠. 앞서서 말씀드린 것처럼 성과 중심 몰입. 저희는 이게 KEES라고 얘기를 했습니다. 그 다음에 관계 중심 몰입. 릴레이션을 기반으로 했다. 그래서 릴레이션 Employee Engagement Scale 그렇게 얘기해서 REES라고 얘기를 했습니다. 과연 이 몰입이 개인적인 차원에서의 성과 그리고 이 조직적인 차원에서의 역할 수행, 그 다음에 역할의 수행 성과에 영향을 미치는지를 살펴보기 위해서 이 다양한 핵심적인 변인들을 저희들이 선정을 했습니다. 또 한 가지는요. 그렇다면 과연 이 몰입에 영향을 주는 선행 요인들을요. 이 JDR, 그러니까 Job Resource and Demand 모델이라고 얘기하죠. 그러니까 직무에서 어떠한 자원이 있고 그 다음에 개인의 어떠한 자원들이 있는가에 따라서 이 몰입의 양상이 달라진다라고 하는데요. 조직 요인, 리더 관계 요인, 직무 요인을 직무 자원적인 측면에서요. 그 다음에 개인적인 측면에서는요. 개인 특성과 관련된 변인들을 여기서 나와 있는 것처럼 다양한 변인들에 대한 설문 도구들을 포함을 시켰습니다. 자, 그래서요, 저희들이 지난해에 앞서서 말씀드린 것처럼 210개 업체, 그렇죠? 210개 업체에 대한 또 이 1503명에 대한 패널을 구축을 한 결과에 대해서, 조사한 결과에 대해서 저희들이 간단한 오버뷰를 이번 시간 동안에 말씀을 드리고자 합니다. 첫 번째입니다. 과연 이 평균적인 측면에서 놓고 보면니까요. 저희들이 보니까 대한민국의 이 직원들은요, 이 산업군을 놓고 봤었을 때 몰입이 많이 된다라고 하는 집단이라고 얘기한다면은요, 직군이라고 얘기한다면은요, 결국 여기서의 몰입은 성과 몰입과 관계 몰입을 합친 몰입을 말씀드릴 수 있겠습니다. 보건 및 사회복지 서비스업, 그다음에 예술, 스포츠 및 여가 서비스업, 금융 및 보험업에서 몰입이 잘 되고 있다라는 것으로 나타나고 있습니다. 비교적 몰입에 대한 평균 점수가 평균보다도 낮은 집단으로 나타난 것은요. 전기가스 및 공기조절업, 출판 영상 및 정보 서비스업, 사업시설 관리 및 임대 서비스업으로 나타나고 있습니다. 또 교육 서비스업이나 도매 및 소매업은요. 이 성과나 관계 몰입에 따라서 상 또는 중 집단에 포함하는 이런 경향성을 나타내고 있는데요. 조직 규모별로 보면은요. 1000인 이상 규모에서는 기업에서는 관계 몰입이 높은 것으로 나타났습니다. 그리고요, 이 300인 미만 규모에서는요, 성과 몰입에 대한 평균 지수가 높은 것으로 나타났습니다. 대한민국 직원 몰입에 대한 100분위 수준, 중위 수준을 한번 살펴보시면은요, 이 관계 몰입이 성과 몰입보다도 일반적으로 100분위 수준이 높은 것으로 나타나고 있습니다. 그리고 이 성과 몰입은 상대적으로 이 관계 몰입보다는 낮은 것으로 나오고 있는 것들 보실 수가 있습니다. 각각에 대해서 말씀을 드리면, 예를 들어서 관계적인 측면에서요, 인지, 정서, 행동 중에서 가장 높은 것으로 지각하고 있는 것은 관계 행동에 있었다라고 이야기가 되고 있습니다. 이렇게 몰입의 양상이 다양하게 나타나고 있다라는 것들 보실 수가 있고요. 저희들이 좀 더 자세한 것은 대한민국 직원 몰입 백서를 곧 출판할 예정입니다. 이 안에서 자세하게 설명을 드릴 예정입니다. 자, 그 다음에요, 과연 저희들이 상정한 이 직원 몰입이라고 얘기하는 것이 과연 조직에서 또 이 개인적인 차원에서 조직에서의 개인의 역할에 있어서 의의 있는 영향을 미치는가라는 거죠. 저희들이 조사한 바에 의하면은요, 이 1,503명에 대한 이런 결과, 10개의 직업군에 대한 사업체에서 일하는 종사자들을 조사한 결과, 관계 몰입은 여러 가지 개인의 심리적인 결과, 그 다음에 개인의 역할의 성과 중에서 친사회적인 행동에 가장 커다란 영향을 미치는 것으로 나타났습니다. 물론입니다. 이 관계 몰입은 심리적인 결과, 역할의 성과 모두에 있어서 의의 있는 어떤 그 영향력을 미쳤다라고 보여지고요. 그것으로 나타나고 있고, 직무소진이라든지 이직 의도하고는요, 그 부적인 효과를 나타내고 있습니다. 그렇다면 이 성과 몰입 같은 경우에는요, 특히 영향을 미치는 변인이 혁신 행동으로 나타나고 있습니다. 이 말씀은요, 결국은 친사회적인 행동이라는 측면에서는요, 관계 몰입이 굉장히 커다란 영향을 미치고 있다. 그 다음에 혁신 행동이라는 측면에서는요, 몰입의 종류에 따라서 놓고 보면은 성과 몰입이 더 많은 영향을 미치고 있다라는 것을 보여줄 수가 있습니다. 자, 그러면요, 이 관계 몰입과 성과 몰입, 좀 구별해서 말씀을 드릴 수가 있는데, 이런 것들이요, 그 직무 자원 이런 측면에서, 특히 조직 환경 측면에서 어떤 게 가장 많이 몰입에 선행적으로 영향을 미치는지 저희들이 찾아봤습니다. 자, 그 결과입니다. 이 관계 몰입에 가장 영향을 많이 미치는 것은요, 조직 문화 중에서는요, 집단 문화인 것으로 나타났습니다. 아무래도 관계성이니까 집단성이 강조가 될 것 같고요. 조직 의사소통이 중요한 것으로 나타났습니다. 그리고요, 이 성과 몰입에서도요, 이 조직 문화들 중에서는 집단 문화가 가장 높은 영향을 미치고요. 성과라는 이런 측면에서 보면은요, 최근에 MZ세대의 특성을 반영해서인지 조직 공정성이 가장 높은 영향을 미치는 것으로 나타났습니다. 물론, 많은 또 다른 여기 앞에 있는 조직 직원 인식이라든지 의사소통, 신뢰, 이런 조직 적합성, 팀 응집성이 모두 다 의의 있는 영향을 미치는 것으로 나타났습니다. 자, 다음입니다. 리더십 측면에서요, 저희가 이 몰입도를 높인다라는 이런 측면에서 놓고 보면은 과연 어떤 리더십을 보이는 게 효과적일까요? 관계 몰입이라는 측면에서 놓고 보면은요, 상사 신뢰, 상사가 보여주는 신뢰가 가장 중요하고요. 마찬가지로 성과 몰입에서도요, 상사의 신뢰가 중요하다고 이야기를 하고 있습니다. 직무 요인적인 측면에서는요, 관계 몰입에서는요, 관계 몰입과 성과 몰입 모두 잡 크래프팅이 중요한 것으로 나타나고 있습니다. 잡 크래프팅, 그러니까 직무 재창조, 직무를 재설계한다라는 거죠. 자기가 하고 있는 일을 과학적인 측면에서, 인지적인 측면에서, 관계적인 측면에서 자유롭게 재창조할 수 있었을 때 몰입 지수가 높아진다라는 것을 보일 수 있습니다. 자, 그렇다면 이 개인적인 여러 가지 이런 심리적인 특성들 중에서요, 이 몰입에 영향을 미치는 요인은 무엇일까요? 흔히들 이 목표 지향성이 굉장히 중요하다라고 얘기를 하는데요. 이 목표 지향성 안에서는요, 특히 자기가 하고 있는 일을 완수하고자 하고 철저하게 이해하고자 하는 숙달 접근, 마스터리, 어프로치 골이 가장 의의 있는 영향력 있는 변인으로 나타나고 있습니다. 그리고요, 이 관계 몰입에는 학습 민첩성과 그 다음에 이 성과 몰입에서도요, 학습 민첩성이 높은 것으로 나타나고 있습니다. 4차 산업혁명 시대에 있어서요, 많은 분들이 그 학습 민첩성 이야기를 하고 있습니다. 바로 이런 학습 민첩성이 개인적인 요인에서 높은 영향을 미치는 것으로 나타나는 것들 살펴볼 수가 있습니다. 지금까지 말씀드린 것처럼요, 저희가 그 HI 이 연구소에서 HI 모델을 통해서 인적자원 몰입 패널을 통해서 살펴본 결과 이 관계 몰입, 성과 몰입 모두 중위 수준은 최소 한 3.6점에서 3.4점 이런 것들을 볼 수 있고요. 그 다음에 그 관계 몰입의 최대점은 4점, 그 다음에 성과 몰입은 3.75점인 것을 볼 수 있습니다. 우리나라의 그 직원들 과연 몰입하고 있는가라고 보면은요, 5점 만점에 3.5점 이상이니까 앞서서 갤럽에서 조사한 몰입도 지수하고 다르게 지금 살펴봤던 저희들이 개발했었던 척도의 근거에서는 상당 부분 몰입을 하고 있다라는 것들을 보실 수가 있습니다. 또 한 가지요, 이 몰입은 다시 말씀드려서 이 몰입은 친사회적인 행동이라든지 혁신 행동에 큰 영향을 미치는 중요한 변이다라는 점들 살펴보실 수가 있습니다. 그렇다면 이 몰입에 영향을 미치기 위해서는 과연 우리 조직과 개인, 그 다음에 이런 팀 차원에서는 어떤 노력을 해야 되냐라는 거죠. 집단 문화가 중요한 것으로 나타났습니다. 조직 의사소통이라든지 조직 공정성이 중요한 것으로 나타났습니다. 그 다음에 리더에 있어서 리더의 역할 중에서 이 상사의 신뢰감이 중요한 것으로 나타났고요. 개인적인 측면에서는요, 잡 크래프팅을 할 수 있도록, 또 그 다음에 개인이 이 과제를 보다 더 잘 완수해 나갈 수 있도록, 그 다음에 민첩성을 많이 부여하는 경우에 이 몰입에 가장 커다란 영향을 주는 것들 살펴보실 수가 있습니다. 자, 저희들이 지금 보여드렸던 것은요, 인적자원 이런 그 패널의 결과입니다. 대한민국 2022년도 한 11개 산업군의 몰입의 현재의 스테이터스를 보여주는 거고요. 사실은 이 몰입이 의미가 있으려면은요, 각각의 그 조직의 상황에 따라서, 그렇죠. 내가 속해져 있는 조직의 특수성을 반영할 때에 보다 더 의미가 있다라고 생각이 됩니다. 저희들이 그러한 시도 중에 한 가지로요, 최근에 케이스 스터디를 진행을 했습니다. 바로 한국 근로복지공단을 대상으로 했었는데요. 코리아 워커스 컴펜세이션 앤드 웰페어 서비스, 이런 아주 굉장히 우리나라에서 커다란 공공기관이라고 말씀을 드릴 수 있습니다. 저희들이 조사한 바에 따르면요, 앞서 있는 HEI 패널에서 보면은요, 이 성과 영역에서 굉장히 많은 변인들이 있었어요. 그렇죠? 그러니까 몰입이 영향을 미치는 변인들. 그 다음에 또 몰입에 영향을 주는 요인들, 직무자원이라든지 개인적인 측면에서 굉장히 많이 있었어요. 그렇죠? 그런데 저희들이 이 근로복지공단하고 같이 조인을 하면서 함께 살펴본 결과, 보시면은요, 그 몰입이 영향을 미치는 요인들로서는요, 개인적인 차원에서는 경력 만족과 직무 소진이, 역할의 성과에서는 직무 성과가, 역할의 성과에서는 이직 의도하고 친사회적인 행동이 중요한 것으로 나타났습니다. 보시는 것처럼 공공기관에서의 혁신 행동은 상대적으로 그 포함이 안 되어 있는 것들 보실 수 있죠. 바로 이런 몰입의 특성 요인 때문이다라는 거죠. 저희들이 지금 이 근로복지공단에서 바로 이 모델을 근거로 해서요, 그 근로복지공단에서 공공기관에서 직원의 몰입에 대한 그 진단 이런 것들을 설문을 실시를 하고 있습니다. 이 진단 설문 실시한 결과를 바탕으로 해서 근로복지공단의 직원 몰입을 제고하기 위한 인터벤션 들 함께 컨설팅까지 함께 지금 준비를 하고 있는데요. 바로 이런 노력들이 각각 그 개개의 어떤 조직들한테 반영이 됐었을 때 우리 사회가, 우리 조직이 보다 더 몰입된 직원들, 또 다음에 보다 더 몰입된 조직들이 함께 이루어질 수 있을 거다라고 생각이 됩니다. 지금까지 저희가 그 몰입에 대해서, 이 한국적인 상황에 대해서, 몰입에 대해서 이런 새로운 차원, 그리고 이 몰입을 보다 더 다양한 차원에서 보여주고자 하는 이런 시도들 잠깐 소개해 드린 바가 있습니다. 저희들이 조금 더 자세한 내용들은요, 2024년 코리안 인게이지먼트 트렌드 백서를 발간할 예정입니다. 이 백서를 통해서 보다 더 한국적 몰입에 대한 자세한 상황 살펴보실 수가 있고요. 앞서서 살펴본 것처럼요, 인적 자본, 인적 자원 패널과 관련된 여러 가지 데이터들을 이용해서 학술대회도 함께 패널 학술대회도 실시할 예정입니다. 많은 관심을 가져주시기 바라고요. 이후로도 좀 더 다양한 연구들과 함께 찾아볼 수 있도록 하겠습니다. 네, 감사합니다.